In the quiet mists above the upper Danube, long before Rome struck her first coins, scattered clans tended narrow fields of barley and watched the river glide like quicksilver beneath the alpine dusk. They were not yet called Celts, for names come late, yet their speech already sang with broad consonants and lilting cadence that would one day echo from Ireland to Anatolia. They shaped bronze into torcs clasped proudly at the throat, and in each ring etched swirling lines that seemed to dance by firelight. These folk lived at the edge of two ages. To the south, the Greek world was honing iron and mapping stars. To the north, the stone sanctuaries of the megalith builders stood silent. Between these poles, the hilltop villages of the Celts awakened. They girded their ridges with timber-laced earth walls, high enough to shelter hearth and storehouse when strangers prowled the valleys. Inside, huts of wattle and daub clustered about kilns where new metals glowed scarlet before turning sober black. Across generations craft improved. Axes grew slender and swords longer, balanced for the upward-cut riders favored. Horsehair standards fluttered in sunlit parades, bards wove first tales of red-cheeked champions whose honor outshone gold. Trade followed the rivers. Amber from the Baltic, coral from Ligurian coasts, and Attic pots reached long tables where chieftains drank honey wine from single-handled cups. Such gatherings bound distant valleys into kinship, and their memory endured on the tongue. Yet abundance carried weight. Rival chiefs tallied herds and iron, and where wineskins were poured too boldly, quarrels hardened. The richest burial mounds of this early Hallstatt horizon tell a story of prestige teetering on peril, four-wheeled wagons laden with bronze cauldrons, iron spearheads laid like rays about the dead, and on the brow a fragile cap of gilded leather, made more for ceremony than war. Goods so fine could not be hidden, they beckoned envy across the hills. Thus the people began to move. Some pressed westward along the Rhone, seeking salt, others followed the Morava Gap southeast, a road of grass into the Balkans. Birthright stretched and rewove itself into fresh patterns. Still, through distance and time, a single thread endured, reverence for the living land. Groves of oak were deemed doors between realms, and at spring equinox elders poured milk at their roots to coax fertile rains. No temple of stone was needed, the clearing itself was sanctum. By the 7th century before the Common Era, the Celt was a traveller upon Europe's spine. His tunic fastened with a long iron pin, her cloak coloured with madder red. They carried small sickles for harvest and knives curved like half-moons for shaping yew boughs. Children learned constellations by story, how the great wheel of the sky turned over the seasons as surely as the potter's wheel below. To be alive was to be within cycles, day and night, seed and bread, oath and redemption. Stillness would not last. To the south, Etruscan traders murmured of cities around an inland sea. A rumor reached the uplands, iron in endless quantity, armor so smooth arrows glanced away. Curiosity stirred in young warriors, and elders convened to weigh the tales. Some counseled caution, others vision. In winter halls, the debate of futures began, a slow spark that would ignite migrations and legends. For now, the fires banked low, and snow drifted across the ramparts. Inside, the clan storyteller rose, lifted an oak-carved staff, and spoke of a time when giants taught men the names of rivers. Children listened, while outside wolves traced silent prints along the tree line. Dawn was not far, with it would come the ringing of hammers, the scent of pine pitch, and the turning of another year in the long awakening of the Celtic world. Though modest in scope, these moments of breath between storm and stride form the quiet overture to a symphony that will soon resound across a continent. Spring returned, quickening the ridges with orchids and pale anemones. From their hillfort above the Danube bend the people gazed southward, for a rumor had become a road. Iron ingots, long bars the weight of a newborn, were moving north on pack mules, stamped with symbols no Celt could read. They came from Etruscan foundries beyond the Alps. With each convoy arrived strangers, slim merchants in scarlet mantles, bracelets heavy with etched bronze. They spoke of a world where harbor keys rang like anvils and ships with painted eyes carried cargo past golden isles. The chieftains received these envoys in timber halls perfumed by juniper. Gifts were exchanged, salt slivers, boar hides, wheeled brooches bright as sunlight on water. But what truly held the Celts' gaze were the foreign swords, straight, leaf-bladed, shimmering with a Polish unknown in the uplands. Warriors ran fingers along edges so keen a breath could split upon them. A bargain was struck, or for skill. Young smiths followed the merchants back across the passes, eager to study bellows twice the size of man and crucibles that kept fire hot as summer noon. While men traveled, so did stories. Minstrels returning from the south spoke of cities layered like honeycomb, each street a channel buzzing with trade. They described sandy coasts where winters were mild and olives grew from crumbling stone terraces. To many ears these wonders sounded less like fact than prophecy. Yet seeds of curiosity fell on fertile minds. In council, a bold chief named Brennus declared that a people who merely watched rivers could never master seas. His words, simple as river pebbles, lodged deep. Meanwhile, across the western forests a new art blossomed, curving, interlocked motifs that curled like smoke upon scabbards and shields. The style, born near the lake of Neuchatel, would later bear the name Latine. Its lines seemed to flow without end, mirroring rivers that tied distant tribes together. In its sweep lay an idea of unity, unspoken, but felt whenever warriors from separate valleys recognized the same patterns on each other's armlets. Identity, once local, was stretching outward like a net cast wide upon the water. With design came discipline. Spear points grew narrower, meant to pierce mail, long shields balanced upon a central boss, easing thrust and rebound. And into each warband entered a figure new to Celtic ranks, the rider with a trumpet-shaped horn. At his signal horses lunged as one, their iron bits jingling a rhythm of power. The sound carried far across clearings, freezing foes mid-stride. Those who marched on foot took heart, for the trumpet promised order amid the storm of battle. Yet war was not constant. Summers could pass in peaceful toil, women twisting flax beneath eaves, children herding dung-coated cattle, elders carving the calendar of feasts upon horn beams. Central to life was Lunarsad, the harvest fair. From 30 leagues around, folk converged on an open plain ringed by oak. They brought pottery, smoked fish, obsidian, and bright shards of coral. Wrestling matches decided long feuds without spilling blood, poets recited sagas judged not by applause, but by the silent nod of fellow bards who knew each meter. At dusk massive wicker wheels filled with straw were lit and rolled downhill, mimicking the sun's own journey. Sparks leaped skyward, and for a night all valleys seemed one. Still, beyond the Alps, tide shifted. Greek settlers had planted a colony at Massalia where the Rhone kisses the sea. Their amphorae bore sweet wine, while their coins carried the face of a lion. Massalia's traders ventured north, bartering for tin and amber. They wrote of tall fair-haired men who fought naked but for paint, whose laughter burst out even as blades met shield rim. They called these men Keltoi, a word of wonder and caution, which in time would echo through Mediterranean ports, each retelling loosening a little of its truth yet fanning its fame. Names, once uttered, gather weight. Keltoi crossed mountain passes faster than mule trains, curving along paths of rumor until it reached the ears of the tribes themselves. At first it was a curiosity, then a badge, then a challenge, live up to the tales sung of you in far-off markets. Pride hardened, ambition stirred like embers catching wind. As the 5th century before the Common Era opened, the Celtic horizon widened beyond old imagining. Children born in hillforts would grow into adulthood beneath banners stitched with strange beasts, marching towards suns that set over waters they had never seen. In quiet corners elders still traced the old constellations, yet between those ancient lights now glimmered new paths, beckoning the restless heart of a people poised between memory and discovery. Summer crested and the mountain passes softened, revealing ribbons of green where only ice had clung. Along these thawing corridors streamed bands of Celts from the upper Rhine and Main, their wagons creaking beneath baskets of grain and the newborn lambs they dared not leave behind. They had heard the trumpet call of Brennus echoed by dozens of chieftains. Beyond the great wall of peaks lay valleys ripe with ironstone and salt, land scarcely settled, and roads that led further still to glittering ports. It was not quite an exodus, more a rolling tide, families, retainers, and spearmen pushing south in stages, claiming clearings with wooden palisades, then moving onward when the soil was turned and the snows next receded. At first the Etruscan strongholds beyond the Po watched with wary tolerance. Celtic traders brought Baltic amber and German pelts. They paid for wine in bullion lumps weighed on balances of bronze. But trade soon blurred with trespass. Hunters from the tribe of the Insubers traced deer far into Etruscan preserves. Youthful warriors, eager to test new iron, rode down into the plains and returned with laughter at how swiftly the city-folk scattered before a single skirmish line. Pride pricked pride. Frontier fortlets sharpened their ditches, yet the very sight of stone walls fed Celtic boldness. If a man could capture such a prize, his renown would outlive song. Meanwhile, on the plateaus north of those cities, a different flowering was underway. The hilltop of Bibracte rose like a ship's prow above thick oak forest. Here artisans from scattered clans gathered under a high palisade to hammer bronze into mirror-bright shields and pour silver mounts for drinking horns. Streets of trampled clay took shape, market squares rang with the calls of salt merchants from the Seine, and over it all loomed a council house where elders carved new laws into lintels, every guest to be fed 3 days, no feud to be fought within the gate, each clan to send 2 youths yearly to learn letters scratched upon a wax board by a Greek scribe hired at dear expense. Bibracte was no empire, yet in its humming lanes one glimpsed the outlines of an urban future the Celts themselves once deemed alien. From such crucibles marched coalitions, loose confederations bound more by shared ambition than oath. One, led by Brennus of the Senones, crossed the Apennines in midsummer 391 BCE. They paused at the Etruscan city of Clusium, demanding land. When the plea was refused, they swept onward, following the Tiber's bends toward a settlement of stout walls and 7 hills. Rome. The chroniclers of that Latin town would later paint the invaders as monstrous in height, hair bleached by lime wash, eyes bright with unreason. Yet the truth was simpler: hungry warriors, hardened by alpine winters, disciplined by seasons of convoy warfare. They fought in loose ranks, shields overlapping only in the first rush, spears hurled before swords flashed. At the river Allia, Roman legions, still young in tactics, found their lines outflanked. Panic rolled through their cohorts like wind through barley, and by sundown the field lay silent but for scavenger crows. Thus, on a dusky August evening, Brennus' vanguard gazed upon Rome's gates. The city had never known a foreign foe within bowshot. Now her citizens either fled to the hills or barred themselves inside the citadel atop the Capitoline. Celtic bands prowled the streets, marveling at tiled roofs and courtyard statues. They set no grand siege, they waited, feasting on stores discovered in merchant cellars, while envoys haggled for ransom. Gold, measured on crooked scales, if Roman annals are to be trusted, bought the invaders' withdrawal. As saddlebags filled, Brennus is said to have tossed his great sword atop the weights, declaring, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. Whether the phrase is legend or memory, its echo trembled far beyond Rome. Here was proof that even rising powers might bend before northern steel. Yet the Celts were not marauders without horizon. Having taken their compensation, they wheeled north, some settling in the valley of the Po, founding Media Lanum and reshaping the land with hedgerows and plough lines. Others recrossed the Alps bearing tales of marble temples and bronze-lunged trumpeters who signaled from city towers. Back in their homelands, such stories mingled with the patterns of Latin art, now spiraling across scabbards and torcs in motifs of griffins and lotus blooms, images absorbed from the very cultures they had unsettled. Still, every expansion sowed its counterweight. Etruscan merchants petitioned for alliances, Latins rebuilt walls thicker than before, Greek colonists at Massalia tightened ties with inland tribes that might serve as buffers. The stage of Europe, once broad and loosely peopled, was contracting under contact, each people defining itself against the other, each skirmish stitching the quilt of nations a little tighter. Amid this tightening weave, the Celts retained their compass, honor earned through courage, wealth measured in cattle and companionship, and a faith that every clearing, every river bend harbored a spirit deserving respect. Before crossing a new ridge, Druids still lifted hazel staffs, reading bird flight against the dawn. The old ways traveled with the new, like a heartbeat beneath armor. And so, as the 4th century unfurled, Celtic warbands stood poised between two destinies, heirs to the wild heartwood and architects of settlements whose very permanence would test the restless soul of their culture. Clouds drifted slow across the great plain of the Po, casting mottled light on new fields where Celtic ploughs had turned black earth into furrowed ribbons. From Media Lanum, the Insubers sent wagonloads of barley and smoked ham back through the Street Bernard Pass, gifts to kin who still guarded the alpine crests. Yet plenty bred rivalry. West of the Ticino, the Torini boasted that their forged blades outshone any made by men of the East. To prove it, they challenged Insuber champions beside the sluggish waters of the Dora. The duel ended in blood, but also in wonder, when both swords shattered at the 12th stroke. Smiths from each tribe knelt to study the shards, debating the mysteries of carbon and quench until dawn. Among Celts, even contest could become congress. Far to the west the Rhone glimmered, a silver road leading to the sea. Down that river moved casks of Marsalian wine, their resin-sealed stoppers impressed with dolphins. In exchange the merchants loaded amber, salt, and a darker cargo, mercenaries. Celtic warriors, famed for ferocity and speed, found ready wages in the armies of Greek tyrants who eyed the Carthaginian garrisons of Iberia with suspicion. Thus galleys carried fair-haired youths past the pillars of Heracles to the fields of Tartessos, where they tasted figs so sweet they seemed spun from light. Service abroad sharpened their sense of scale. Mountains once thought lofty shrank beside the Sierra Nevada. Cities they deemed vast were mere quarters of Carthago Nova. The world was widening, and the Celts took its measure with hungry eyes. In their homeland of Gaul, though that name had yet to settle, new federations coalesced. Chief among them rose the Arverni, whose hill of Jagovia overlooked vineyards tiered like amphitheaters. Under King Luernios, caravan tolls were lifted, attracting craftsmen from as far as Venetia. These artisans brought glass beads of swirling blues and greens. Arvernian women wove them into hair which, combed with bare grease and chalk, fanned like pale flames in the sun. Wealth accumulated, yet Luernios was famed less for hoard than for largesse. One midsummer he is said to have ridden beside a wagon that scattered golden coins across the plain, inviting any man, free or bond, to keep what he might snatch. If the tale gilds reality, its glint still mirrors a cultural truth. Generosity affirmed greatness more surely than any wall. Eastward along the Danube another current flowed, peoples uprooting not for profit but for promise of dominion. The boy, restless in the Bohemian basin, looked south to the flat grasslands of Pannonia, rich in game and bordered by rivers broad enough to raft whole villages. They crossed in waves, carrying totem standards crested with bronze birds whose wings rattled in the wind. Behind them followed Sigini horse breeders, eager to barter steppe ponies for iron bits. The confluence of customs, Celtic infantry discipline and nomad cavalry craft, birthed a new warfare, swift as it was loud. Drums thundered like hooves, curved swords met long-thrusting spears, smoke of dung-fueled fires curled above hastily fenced camps that could be dismantled by noon and rebuilt at dusk. These migrations brushed the borders of Macedon, where once mighty Philip had died and his son Alexander had raced east into legend. Now, decades after that whirlwind, the successors quarreled over fragmented realms. Into this fracture stepped envoys from the Paeonian tribes, warning of northern hosts gathering beyond the Sava. King Ptolemy Ceraunus, newly seated upon a shaky Macedonian throne, dismissed them. "Let the barbarians come, my soldiers need fresh plunder." The arrogance proved mortal. In winter of 279 BCE 3 great Celtic columns, Telistobogii, Tectosiges, and a reunited Brennid host, poured through the Morava gate toward Thessaly. Snow muffled their march until, descending, they seemed to burst from the very ribs of the mountains. At Daumon they burned temples, yet paid in silver for grain, for theirs was no mindless ruin but a venture for lands and fame. Southward they pressed, a rolling thunder beneath olive groves, until the twin peaks of Parnassus cast their evening shadow over the plain of Delphi. The shrine, heart of Hellenic prophecy, stood wreathed in laurel and legend. Greek cities, fractured though they were, rallied what hoplites they could. Priests carried omens of Apollo's anger, swearing that avalanches would guard the sacred navel of the earth. When the Celtic advance guard reached Delphi's terraces, they found sleet driving sideways, winds shrieking like pipes. Some later chroniclers spoke of statues that sweated or weapons that fell from phantom hands, portents magnified with each retelling. What is certain, the invaders reeled before sudden mountain storms and a fierce counterstroke by Aetolian slingers who knew every goat track. Supplies dwindled, and for the first time since crossing the Hellenic frontiers the momentum faltered. Brennus, wounded by a javelin, ordered retreat. The withdrawal became a slog through ravines where Greek light troops harried the rear. Thousands perished, others splintered into roving bands. Yet disaster did not dissolve ambition. Survivors under leaders Leonorius and Leuterius turned east, following the coast to Byzantium, then ferried across the Bosporus by a frightened garrison glad to see their backs. In the rich plateau of central Anatolia they carved new domains, extracting tribute from warring dynasts. Locals called the newcomers Galatai, Gauls of the East, and the land itself would bear their name, Galatia. Back in Europe, tales of Delphi spread among Celtic homesteads like hearthfire gossip. Some spoke in rueful pride, few peoples had dared challenge the very seat of Apollo. Others saw warning, the gods of the south fought with storms no spear could master. Still, the defeat did not chill Celtic enterprise, it redirected it. Attention pivoted west toward the jagged bays of Armorica and the broad rivers of Celtica, where rumor told of copper seams and isles afloat with tin. From these murmurs would bloom new ventures, and amid them, fresh conflicts destined to test the mettle of both Celtic freedom and the rising republic that nursed its wounds far to the south on the Tiber. Down the Atlantic fringes, winds laden with salt swept over headlands where gulls cried above dark surf. Along these coasts, small Celtic settlements clung to rock and heath, their round houses ribbed with timber and thatched with reed. Here the sea was not barrier but highway. At spring tides coracles of wicker and tar skim between inlets, carrying copper ingots from the cliffs of Ivernia and slate-bladed sickles destined for the valleys of Armorica. When fog closed in, mariners sounded bone horns whose mournful notes rolled across the water like distant thunder, guiding boats to safe coves scented with kelp. Inland, the heart of Gaul pulsed with new energy. Warehouses of split oak rose beside the Saône and Loire, dwarfed only by the sprawling oppida, fortified towns, that now crowned many hills. At Avaricum, stout walls of timber-laced earth enclosed broad streets lined with workshops where potters fired wheel-thrown jars, their red slip burnished to a sheen rivaling Italian ware. Across the ramparts, roots of packed gravel radiated like spokes, linking Avaricum to Carnute grain fields, Biturage vineyards, and the iron forges of the Aeduans. Merchants began to trust not simply clan ties but stamped lead tokens that certified weight and purity. Slowly, a lattice of credit spread, delicate yet resilient as spider silk. With commerce blossomed ideas. Druids, the law-keepers, travelled freely, welcomed at every hearth. In sacred groves they taught astronomy, law, and the secret language of trees, tallying years by the growth of mistletoe upon oak. Their influence tempered rivalry among chieftains, for a king who defied Druid judgment risked censure that could unravel alliances faster than any sword. Yet even these sages sensed change. Youths returned from Massalia quoting Aristotle, traders discussed tides using Phoenician reckoning. Knowledge, like iron, was being forged anew in the heat of contact. Across the narrow sea to the northwest, the island that future ages would call Britain stirred beneath its cloak of forest and moor. Tribes such as the Durotriges and Debunny mined alluvial tin and smelted it in wind-blown hearths perched on cliff-tops. With each cargo ferried southward, bronze once scarce in Gaul became plentiful, and artisans melded it with iron to craft lattice-hilt swords whose balance felt almost weightless in the hand. Tales of these marvels reached continental warlords, drawing them to embark on summer ventures across the strait, eager for both metal and renown. One such leader was Diviciacus of the Suessionese. Tall, quick-smiling, he understood both the spear drill of veterans and the quieter arithmetic of tribute. Gathering a fleet of flat-bottomed transports, he crossed to Cantium, landing among wheat fields bright with poppies. His force met little resistance. Instead, local chiefs offered hostages and ox hides in exchange for alliance against rival tribes inland. Diviciacus spent winters on the island, dining on smoked eel and mead laced with heather honey, his presence stitching the Channel tribes into the wider fabric of Gaulish politics. Yet horizons widened faster than unity. In the south, Rome, shaken but unbroken since Brennus, had rebuilt its legions with iron discipline and a new code of roads that bound colony to capital as sinew binds bone. Legionaries drilled on the banks of the Arno, consuls studied maps where rivers of Gaul were no longer blank spaces but beckoning lines. Word reached Celtic traders that Roman surveyors now discussed the Rhone delta in tones of possession. To many Gauls this seemed a distant tremor. But along the Via Domitia, built to link Italy with friendly Massalia, outposts multiplied, each a seed of Roman order sown in Celtic soil. Not all Celts watched passively. The Arvernian prince Bituitos dispatched envoys bearing wheels of cheese and panthers' pelts to Carthaginian Iberia, seeking partners who might check Roman creep. Meanwhile the Volcae Tecticiges, returned from Anatolian exploits flush with eastern silver, fortified Tolosa in the shadow of the Pyrenees, stockpiling weapons and corn. Old rivalries slumbered as chieftains sensed a larger storm brewing beyond the Alpine curtain. Amid tension, life's rhythms endured. At Samhain, families extinguished hearth fires and kindled new flame from a communal bonfire, believing the renewed spark carried luck into the dark half of the year. In dawn's pale hush, children leapt across embers, while elders whispered the names of ancestors toward the paling stars. Cattle were led between twin blazes to guard against plague, warriors anointed spearheads with rendered fat to keep rust at bay. These rites, older than the memory of iron, bound community no less firmly than palisades. Thus, as the 2nd century before the Common Era opened, the Celtic world stood at a threshold. Trade routes stretched like shining threads from Hibernian headlands to Anatolian plateaus. Oppida rose where once only stockades stood, Druids weighed fresh wisdom against ancestral law. Yet beyond Rhone and Alps a disciplined republic watched, its ambitions expanding with every mile of stone road laid. The Celts, heirs to wanderers and smiths, would soon confront a power unlike any faced before, one that measured victory not in raids or ransoms, but in provinces and permanence. The stage was set, the actors gathering. The next act would test whether freedom could outpace empire's relentless march. High summer warmed the vine terraces of the lower Rhone when the first Roman legionaries marched beyond Massalia's walls, their oval shields shining like tiled roofs in the light. They came, the Senate claimed, to rescue Greek allies harried by Ligurian raiders, yet the true design ran deeper. Rome hungered for a corridor to Hispania that would never close with winter snows, and the river valleys of southern Gaul offered a ready thoroughfare. So the Via Domitia pushed northwestward, milestone after milestone, each quarter-cut block announcing a new logic of conquest, distance measured in strides, terrain bent to purpose, men and mountains alike entered in ledgers. The Salies, first to feel the weight of iron-shod sandals, fought amid their sacred groves near Entremont. Slink stones clattered against Scuta, but pilum and short sword broke the loose hillbands with grim certainty. When smoke died, the Romans raised a fortified market at Aquae Sextii, naming it for the consul Sextius Calvinus. Around its grid of streets clustered craftsmen who had once served Celtic chiefs, their forges now ringing to Roman contracts. South Gaulish pottery assumed Latin shapes, and amphorae stamped VB, vinum bonum, began to travel the new road east into Etruria. Word of these footholds flew upriver on trader tongues. North of the Durance, the Vocontii weighed tribute against ruin and chose uneasy peace, handing over hostages and right-of-way. But the Arverni, proud heirs of Luernios, would not yield coin for corridor. King Bituitus, broad-chested, white-bearded, a torc thick as a man's thumb at his neck, summoned allies from the Allobroges and Segusiavi. Messengers rode day and night, their cloaks stiff with dust, until 30,000 spears shivered in sunlight beneath the broken ridges of the Vercors. Into this gathering strode the Roman proconsul Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, gaunt and severe. He fortified his camp with the same meticulous ditches that had fenced Numidian plains and looked upon Celtic numbers without tremor. Near Vindalium, on a plain striped by irrigation dikes, his slingers from the Balearics opened battle, peppering the forward ranks until shields bristled like boar hides. When Bituitus hurled cavalry to break the missile storm, legion cohorts parted as if on hinge, revealing engines hauled from Massalia, scorpions that spat yard-long bolts through horse and rider alike. Dismay rippled, Domitius advanced, Pila falling in murderous arcs, the Celtic centre folded and fled toward the Rhone's reed-choked banks, where many drowned under the weight of mail and fear. Bituitus retreated across the Isere, rallying what shattered honour remained. Yet another consul, Quintus Fabius Maximus, struck north from Narbo, closing the jaws. At the confluence of Rhone and Isere, the Arvernian host made final stand. Trumpets of curved bronze wailed, druids cried blessings above the din, but discipline unravelled before the Roman triple line. Bituitus was captured alive, silver inlaid armour glinting among plain legion mail as he was led in chains to a triumph he would not see, banished instead to a waterlogged villa in distant Alba where his songs of past glory echoed only to marsh birds. With the Arverni broken in 121 BCE, Rome proclaimed Provincia, the province, stretching from the Alps to the Pyrenees. Legion pickets shaded vineyards, colonnii sprouted colonnades, and Latin speech seeped like dye into the wool of daily barter. Yet conquest carried seed of further turmoil. Dispossessed warriors drifted north, their bitterness fermenting in taverns of Bibracte and Cenabum. They spoke of Roman roads slicing the land like winter ice, of taxes weighed in silver unfamiliar and unforgiving. Among their listeners were youths whose fathers had perished at Vindalium, boys who would grow into men resolved that the next reckoning would not end in chains. Far beyond these simmering valleys another cloud gathered, restless nations from the Baltic sands, Cimbri, Teutons, Ambrones, seeking sun-warmed acres they believed lay south behind Celtic hills. They pressed upon Helvetian borders, and the Helvetii in turn eyed the rich pastures of Provincia. Thus pressure built, link by link, until the vast movement of peoples threatened to surge like spring flood across all defenses. Amid this brooding landscape, in the Hilfert of Jagovia, a child of noble blood first held a toy sword carved from ash. His name, Vercingetorix, king of great warriors, passed with pride through the smoky hall. None could yet foresee how his path would braid the many threads of grievance, hope, and peril now intertwining through Gaul. But for the moment province and free land balanced in uneasy twilight, milestones and mistletoe, legion camp and sacred grove, the ordered beat of marching feet against the old heartbeat of the forest, a pause before storms yet unspent. The cold wind out of Jutland carried with it a rumble older than tribe or tongue. Across the marshes of the Cimbric peninsula whole villages uprooted at once, wagons creaking beneath wolfskin tents, oxen lowing, children clutching carved toys of driftwood. The Cimbri moved first, but soon the Teutons and Ambrones joined, drawn by rumors of a southern land where winter came gentle and grain rose to a man's waist. Their wooden wheels etched tracks through the forests of the Hermanduri, then followed the bending Elbe toward the frontier of the Helvetia. At the Lake of Bienne the two hosts met, the Helvetian councils, proud guardians of upland meadows, and the tide of northern migrants whose sheer numbers made the mountains seem suddenly narrow. No pact could hold them together, the Helvetia chose defiance, blocking passes with felled pines. Yet the Cimbri were not bent upon conquest of Gaul, only passage. They thrust west around the barrier, brushing the Helvetia aside and pouring into the valley of the Saône like meltwater in spring. News of the great wanderers reached the Roman Senate in 113 BCE. A consular army marched to Noricum, where the Taurici had appealed for aid, and there, at Noreia, they learned terror. The legion lines buckled under the first rush of chariot spearmen and colossal shield walls woven of interlocked oaken boards. In torrential rain the Roman standards vanished amid screaming horses, survivors stumbled south with tales of giants whose helmets gleamed like stormlit waves. Gaul watched, half awed, half uneasy. Some Oppida opened their gates to the moving host, trading wheat for iron trinkets and safe passage. Others barred walls and raised fire signals along ridges. Among the Arverni there grew a cautious hope, here was a hammer that might shatter the provincial yoke. But hope requires harness, and the Cimbri knew no master save hunger. For nearly a decade the wanderers roamed. They skirted the high Massif Central, crossed the Garonne, and reached the Atlantic spray at the Bay of Biscay. There they turned, divided by counsel. The Cimbri would circle into Iberia, the Teutons and Ambrones back east toward the Rhone plain. Their passage left valleys stripped of fodder, yet also carried fresh crafts, broad-bladed axes of northern steel and wagon hoods sewn from tightly woven flax that shed water like oiled skin. Rome, reeling from defeats at Arausio where 80,000 citizens and allies fell in a single sun-blazed afternoon, summoned Gaius Marius. The new consul drilled shattered levies into a professional corps, men of no property given arms, their loyalty bought with land grants. Pilum shafts were shortened to prevent enemy return throw. Legion camps became earth-walled fortresses raised anew each night, discipline hammered by centurions whose vine-staff blows cared nothing for birth. These reforms spread whispered admiration even among Celtic scouts who watched the training from shadowed ridges. In 102 BCE Marius awaited the Teutons near Aquae Sextiae. He chose rough ground above a stream choked with willow, terrain where chariots could not wheel. For 3 days the barbarians taunted the silent red line, then at dawn Roman horns split the mist and 2 hidden cohorts stormed the enemy rear. Trapped between wave and anvil, the Teutons ride. Their queen Teutoboda leapt into a wagon creek with her daughters rather than bend to chains. By nightfall the river ran thick, and Marius piled enemy shields into towering altars to victory. A year later, on the plains of Vercelli beneath a merciless Lombard sun, the Cimbri met the same fate. Their king Biarrix fell beside the eagle of the 3rd Legion. Surviving women strangled their children with braided hair before surrender. The long migration ended in silence broken only by crackle of funerary pyres. Gaul felt both relief and foreboding. The same legions that crushed the Northmen now turned eyes upon any land that threatened Rome's roads. Yet Marius did not march deeper, his struggles lay within the Forum, where rival nobles sharpened law into weapon. For a generation Gaul knew a breathing space. Trade revived, Druid conclaves in the Carnute groves renewed vows to keep peace among tribes. Young Vercingetorix, now a lean youth with storm-grey eyes, trained his first warhorse on Jugovia's slopes, noting how Roman drills forgave no slack rein. But beneath that calm the province grew ever more Roman, baths steaming beside Celtic wells, villas spreading mosaic laughter over fields once sown by communal toil. Veterans of Marius accepted land allotments between Rhone and Isere, their marble ancestor shrines rising like alien flowers among long barrow mounds. Each new roof tile glinting in southern sun signaled a subtle conquest deeper than any spear thrust, the slow settling of habit, the patient colonization of the mind. Along the Rhine the Sequani quarreled with Aeduan neighbors over tolls, and each sought allies among the Germanic tribes beyond the dark water. Ariovistus of the Suebi answered that call, recrossing the river with seasoned warriors hungry for plunder. His presence alarmed more Gauls than it comforted. They dispatched discreet embassies southward, bearing talks of red gold and finely chased cups to the magistrates of Rome, petitioning for arbitration. Thus door and threshold met again. Rome listened, if only to weigh advantage, and a certain ambitious proconsul named Gaius Julius Caesar contemplated the map spread before him. He saw not fractured clans but opportunity, clients to be won, rivalries to be bent, glory to be harvested like wheat before autumn storm. The decade of respite was ending, and in its place approached a campaign that would test every oath, every boundary, every dream the Celts held of freedom under the wide, star-crossed sky. Spring's thaw of the year 58 BCE found the mist curling off Lake Geneva like breath from the mouth of fate. On its northern shore, smoke plumes rose from hamlets of the Helvetia. By tribal decree they set torch to their own farmsteads, vowing never again to drift back into old valleys. With wagons stacked 6 high and oxen yoked in mournful lines, they meant to cross Gaul westward, seeking new soil beyond the Garumna where Rome's writ still flickered weak. Word reached the Roman proconsul camped at the foot of the Alps. Gaius Julius Caesar rode the length of the Rhone, measured its crossings, and conscripted every local carpenter. In just 19 days a palisade of earth, ditch, and timber stretched from Jura foothills to lake water, 16 miles of sudden wall barring the Helvetia at Geneva's bridge. Chief sent envoys draped in plaid, asking safe passage. Caesar, reading destiny in their desperate eyes, refused with courtly chill. Forced north, the migrant mass threaded the narrow gorge of the Sequani, their carts groaning under shattered memories. Along the sluggish Ara the column paused. Helvetian warriors knelt to cup the clear water, unaware that Roman legionaries pressed night march in their wake. At first light Caesar's vanguard crossed on hastily lashed rafts, spearing the rearguard of the Tigerini clan with such surprise that none could unshackle shields before death took them. Yet the main host still rolled onward, 100,000 souls with wagon rings bristling like hedgehog spines. 3 days later, near the wooded slopes of Bibracte, the Helvetii wheeled to fight. Their nobles formed a living wall, shields high, spears wedged against the earth. Behind them rose cries of children and the creak of wagons circled tight as fortress. At noon the legion standards advanced, Pila hurled in a silver hail. Many split shield boards, more punched clean through bronze corselets. Roman infantry closed, Gladius working in relentless rhythm, driving the Helvetii uphill then down again toward their own barricades. Dust and blood veiled the late sun, but when darkness fell the migrant army broke, scattering across Morvan uplands. 6 nights of pursuit ended at the Ain, where exhausted chiefs yielded hostages and oaths to return east and guard the alpine paths they had abandoned. Caesar, with a gesture both stern and curiously pitying, supplied them grain for the trek. Defeat turned to favor that bound debtor to victor. Victory rippled through Gaul, yet unease deepened. For in driving out the Helvetii, Rome had stepped squarely into Gallic quarrels. Soon came embassies from Aedui and Sequani alike, pleading deliverance from Ariovistus, the Suban king whose long-limbed horsemen now camped west of the Rhine. Caesar, sensing a triumph fit for annals, summoned Germanic envoys and demanded hostages' release. Ariovistus answered that he bowed only to fortune, not to senatorial ink. Thus legions marched east to Vesontio, a loop of the Dubis River clasping white limestone cliffs. Here Roman recruits faltered, chilled by rumors that Suebi fought in wedge blocks unbreakable and that their women cast lots before battle, foretelling doom for foes. Caesar gathered his centurions, spoke of past glories carved from terror, and offered death or honor, no middle path. Spirits steadied, fortifications rose, supply lines thickened with Aeduan grain. On the broad plain beneath the Vosges, under a sky hard as hammered iron, the armies met. German wedges struck first, singing deep battle chants, Roman ballistae answered with stones that clove gaps in the dense ranks. Caesar, seeing the Suban right begin to fold, led the 10th Legion in a slanting thrust aimed at Ariovista's scarlet standard. Once the banner toppled, panic coursed like lightning. The Suebi fled toward the Rhine, many drowning in its swirling autumn flood. Their king escaped by narrow galley, leaving hostages and baggage to Roman hands. Gaul exhaled, though not in relief alone. Some chieftains toasted the deliverer from German tyranny, others measured the cost of such salvation. Caesar took hostages from friend and former foe alike, quoting necessity. 5 legions wintered in Sequani territory, huts set in Cardo-Decumanus grid, watchfires pricking the frosted hills. Supplies were drawn from barns that had once filled Aeduan granaries, payment stamped in freshly minted denarii bearing Caesar's name. In Jagovia's hall, Vercingetorix listened to returning scouts count every Roman trench and timber tower. He said little, only testing the edge of a newly wrought sword against his thumb until a bead of blood blossomed. Snow drifted outside, soft as falling ash, the hush before a conflagration whose embers already glowed in far-flung hearts. When frost lifted from the hedgerows of early spring 57 BCE, Caesar unfurled fresh standards and pointed them north toward the rolling plains of the Belgae. These clans, Nervii, Atrebates, Viromandui, Eburones, and more, were famed for stern hearts and scant wine. They drank milk thick with herbs and slept in ring-fenced farmsteads behind low willow palings. Rumor said they shunned merchants lest softness seep in. Caesar's scouts counted 60,000 spears assembling near the Axona, so the legions marched in 8 orderly columns, fording streams still swollen with snowmelt. At Bibrax the Remi, old friends of Rome, barred their gates against their kinsmen and begged protection. Caesar planted his camp on a ridge flanked by marsh, then watched Belgic waves crash against earthworks all night, shields flashing like beetle backs in torchlight. When dawn rose, Roman cavalry swept the attackers' flanks, driving them back across the river where rising waters broke cohesion. The alliance cracked, tribal hosts drifted home to guard their own fields, leaving only the Nervii and their closest allies unbowed. These Nervii hid behind no wall. Lean, austere, they cut hedges into living ramparts and waited beside the Sabines amid older copses. Caesar's army stumbled onto them at midday while pitching tents, pila were still stacked, helmets unstrapped. With a howl the Nervii surged, wicker shields overlapping, javelins dense as summer hail. The Roman left collapsed, cohorts buckled to the river bank. Caesar grabbed a shield from a centurion, rallied fugitives by name, and stemmed the breach. The 10th and 9th legions wheeled inward, striking the Nervian flank, allied cavalry circled, severing retreat. Evening found the field carpeted with thorn-torn bodies, and the Nervii, once proudest of the Belgae, reduced to a remnant too few to till their own orchards. Victory echoed, but Caesar pressed farther, west into the low dunes of the Morini and Menipii, then south through oak-dark Aquitania where broad-winged eagles rode thermals above the Garonne. Here warbands fought in scattered ambush, slinging sun-baked stones from cliff ledges. A lieutenant, Publius Crassus, coaxed Gascon tribes by swift sieges and swifter pardons. Opida that opened gates kept chiefs and cattle, while those that resisted tasted the Roman ramming beak. 2 campaigning seasons spent, Caesar sought to dazzle Rome with unheard-of exploits. In 55 BCE he spanned the Rhine itself. Timber piles as thick as a legionary's thigh were driven into the current, locked by crossbeams until a roadway trembled above the brown surge. 10 days' labor, and the unthinkable stood, a bridge where no bridge had dared. Swaby scouts watching from far sandbanks saw only dust as the legions crossed, burned villages long emptied, then recrossed and hacked the structure down, gesture of power more than conquest. Ambition swept him still farther west. That same late summer, with borrowed Venetic ships and oar-handled impatience, he ferried 2 legions across the narrow strait to the chalk cliffs of Britannia. Coastal tribes showered the landing beach with flint-tipped shafts, and gales tore anchor ropes, yet for 18 days Roman standards fluttered on foreign soil. No province was made, but hostages and curiosity returned to Gaul, along with reports of iron bar money and chariots whose scythed wheels sang like locusts. While Caesar chased orisons, Gaul itself smoldered. Tribute weighed heavy, corn levies bit deep. Winters saw timber harvest not for Gallic hearths but for legion palisades. In the north, the Venelli muttered against Aeduan privilege. In the center, Canute Smith's hammered sword hilts embossed with a rising sun, sign of new hope. Most dangerous of all, in the Oven Hillforts, Vercingetorix matured from watchful noble to quiet firebrand. He studied Roman chains of supply, their hour-marked marches, the arrogance that grew with every milestone. Among young riders he spoke of unity, not under Druid sanction alone but under hard discipline, cloaks cut short for speed, horses light, villages ready to burn at a signal so invaders would inherit only ash. By the close of 54 BCE Caesar believed Gaul subdued. He quartered legions widely, one with the Morini, another among the Eburones under their subtle king Ambiorix, and departed for a second, grander venture in Britain. Snow fell over emptying fields, quiet enough to hear the slow creak of resentment turning, like a millstone gathering momentum in the dark. Winter lay heavy over Gaul, whitening reed beds and silencing stream banks. Legion camps, scattered like red-tiled islands amid the frost, seemed secure behind rampart and ditch. Yet to the northeast, in the misty forests of the Eburones, riders gathered beneath bare oaks. Their king, Ambiorix, long deferential to Rome, now measured freedom against the weight of grain exacted for faraway wars. He walked the fireline of his council circle, cloak drawn tight, recounting how families starved while storehouses at Achuchuca brimmed for Roman mouths. Murmurs swelled. Spears tapped frozen earth in ascent. Ambiorix struck first. On a dawn still muffled by fog he approached the Roman winter camp with a small escort, pleading urgent news, German raiders, he claimed, mass beyond the Meuse. He urged the officers, Titurius Sabinus and Aurunculius Cotta, to abandon their exposed post and march toward friendly quarters. Trusting the seeming goodwill of a man they called ally, the legate agreed. Columns filed out, baggage wagons rattling. 2 miles into the narrow defile of the Tongres, horns blared from every thicket and boulders tumbled from ridges. Showered by javelins, the Romans formed square, but the path denied maneuver. Sabinus fell in parley, Cotta fighting beside him. Only scattered cohorts hacked free through briars to carry word of ruin. The sudden blow rippled across the province. The Nervii besieged Quintus Cicero's encampment near the Sabines, timber towers rose overnight, and wicker screens advanced behind clouds of arrows fletched with corvid feathers. Inside, the legion toiled without rest, dousing firebrands, patching ramparts with hide strips torn from mule carcasses. Homing pigeons, last insurance of the Roman post, fluttered up through sleet bearing pleas for rescue. One reached Caesar, encamped with the Belgae. He marched 6 days without halt, lighting no campfires, covering sodden tracts by torch, and at dawn fell upon the besiegers' rear. Sound of his trumpets bent the siege line outward like a bow, the Nervii scattered to wood still echoing with their own victory songs now curdled into dismay. Yet Gaul's resentment only deepened. Tribes once neutral tasted the fragile ache of possibility. Menapii burned Roman grain barges along the Scheldt, Treveri drummed war inside their valleys. Caesar retaliated with campaigns brutal in swiftness, villages leveled, cattle herded south as living spoils, prisoners sold to Italian speculators who followed the eagles like shadow. The Eburones he vowed to erase. He summoned legions and German cavalry auxiliaries, spreading them in a vast net to scour every hut, every hollow log where fugitives might crouch. Still, Ambiorix eluded grasp, melting across the Rhine marshes beyond even Suban trackers. The land he left behind became a wasteland of ash, charred orchards standing like black ribs against winter sky. Amid ruin and repression, a different vision stirred in the uplands of the Arverni. Vercingetorix, now chief following the stern rites of succession, listened to refugees recount the fate of the Eburones. He rode through hamlets reminding kin of Brenna's glory and of Bituitus' downfall, that freedom lay neither in plunder nor in negotiation but in unity sealed by sacrifice. Opponents within his own clan called him reckless, they banished him from Jugovia's gates. He answered by assembling outcasts, promising equal share of danger and reward. When he returned, torchlight flickered upon walls already manned by converts to his cause. The council reversed itself under the roar of the crowd. Vercingetorix assumed command, striking sparks from flint to kindle beacons across the winter ridges. Messengers galloped through sleet-numbed nights bearing rods of knotted cord, each knot counted a day until uprising. Carnutes, guardians of the central grove, pledged to open hostilities. On the appointed morning, they stormed Cenabum, slaughtering Roman traders at market stalls heavy with salted fish and dyed linen. The town's timber bridge burned crimson against the grey Loire, smoke spiraling high as a standard. Signal fires leapt ridge to ridge, armor long cached beneath sacred altars was lifted out, wiped free of oil-caked dust, and fitted to eager shoulders. Caesar, wintering in distant Cisalpine Gaul to oversee provincial courts, learned of the revolt by courier racing across alpine snows. He left administration mid-sentence, covering leagues at a pace rivaling rumor. Crossing the ceaseless roar of the Isere in icy spate, he rejoined 2 legions near Narbo, then forced marches through sleet-slick passes to gather scattered cohorts. Supply, always the hinge of Roman might, buckled, roads lay ambushed, convoys seized. Thus Caesar turned predator. Cenabum he retook in a day, its population he sold wholesale as warning. But every brutal reprisal minted more enemies than corpses. Town after town barred gates, wells defiled, granaries fired. The land itself resisted, fields wasted to deny forage, for Vercingetorix had decreed that scorched earth bought time. Through late winter both commanders probed. Caesar struck at Velonodunum, then Noviodunum, seizing grain. Vercingetorix harried the baggage columns, cutting messengers, slipping away before Auxilia could pin him. Neither blow proved decisive, yet beneath these feints, the grand game shaped itself. All Gaul now weighed loyalties, armor hung once as heirloom now donned, river fords secretly mapped, Druids invoking ancient compacts that no Roman proclamation could annul. As the vernal equinox approached and blossoms struggled through lingering frost, two truths crystallized. Rome would never relinquish Gaul of its own accord, and the Gauls, under a single will, might at last wield their numbers like a bronze-edged scythe. Both destinies bent toward the same hill fortress whose ramparts crowned oven heights, Gergovia, cradle of rebellion and first anvil upon which the fate of a continent would be hammered. April's sun climbed, pale as hammered tin, over the central plateau. Around Gergovia's basalt crown stretched a ring of Gaulish fires, watch beacons set by Vercingetorix to touch every horizon. Inside the ramparts, smiths worked without pause, bellows roaring until night vibrated like a drum. Bronze chariot fittings glowed, spearheads quenched with a hiss like snakes in tall grass. Women wove slingcords from twisted horsehair, children fetched water from the steep cistern stairs, and druids chalked boundary charms upon each gatepost. A city readied not only to endure but to teach its enemies fear. Caesar arrived from the west with 6 legions, lines lean after winter privation. He saw at once the problem, Gergovia perched on a spur whose flanks fell sheer for 500 paces, accessible only by the saddle of La Roche. Direct assault meant men clambering uphill beneath missile rain. He lodged camps on twin ridges opposite the town, connecting them by a covered way of turf and stakes. Nightfall found Roman pickets hammering stakes while Gallic sentinels hurled taunts across the dark valley. Supplies weighed upon the Roman mind. From the Aedui granaries south of the Loire, convoys should have come, but Aeduan loyalty wavered. Vercingetorix had whispered that any tribe aiding Rome became its slave forever. Gold torcs changed hands in shadow-lit halls, and soon Aeduan escorts turned bandit, seizing grain meant for Caesar. News reached the proconsul as his soldiers measured out half rations. He reacted with theatrical swiftness, galloping to Decitia, rebuking wavering chiefs, binding new oaths, but trust could not be whipped into life like a mutinous century. Unable to starve Gergovia, Caesar plotted deception. A dawn mist rose thick, trumpets sounded in the lower camp while hidden cohorts marched behind the ridge to seize a minor wall segment midway up the slope. The diversion worked. Gauls ran toward Clamor at the front gate while the 10th and 11th Legion scrambled unseen, scaling terraces of vine and scree. They captured a stone breastwork and unfurled crimson vexilla. Cheers leapt valley to valley. Yet discipline frayed in triumph. The leading ranks pressed onward, lured by shouts of fugitives. The town is empty. Standards pushed through another gate, but inside lay a second line, higher, stronger, manned by Arvernian veterans and Allobriges in heavy mail. Javelins sang downward, sling stones cracked skulls. From the citadel Vercingetorix released cavalry through a postern, sweeping behind the exposed cohorts. Roman advance became jam, a mass of shields wedged on stairs slick with spilled wine jars and rolling debris. Trumpeters signaled recall, their notes lost in echo. Caesar, witnessing from the saddle ridge, seized a small guard and charged to stem rout. He grabbed a centurion's shield, planted himself where the slope narrowed, and shouted the order to fall back in ranks of 6. Those still capable obeyed. Others tumbled, dragged by wounded comrades, until the hillside glittered with discarded helmets. Night cloaked the valley before pursuit ceased. Losses counted near 700 dead, a price heavy for legions already thin. Among the fallen lay 46 centurions, veterans whose crested helmets once steadied new recruits. In Caesar's commentaries he called the setback a reverse, in soldiers' whispers it became a curse. The Gauls exulted. Vercingetorix paraded captured armor along the ramparts, tossing Roman coins to children so they might remember the day foreigners broke against their walls like winter hail. Caesar knew he could not linger. Aedui insurgents now cut bridges along the Loire, eager to trap him in Oven's high bowl. He feigned preparations for renewed assault, then at midnight struck camp, marching south along ridge crests, torches wrapped so tight their glow vanished a yard away. For 3 days legions threaded forest gullies, crossing streams waist-deep, until they reached the Allia. There, engineers flung a bridge from raft lash to raft. Once across, Caesar burned it, leaving pursuers stranded on the far bank. Gergovia stood unconquered, and with its survival the Gaulish revolt swelled. Tribes hesitated no longer. Rutini, Cadurci, Parisii, Pictons, each sent riders bearing the fiery brand of alliance. 70,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and a tumult of irregulars now gathered beneath Vercingetorix's eagle-feather banner. He proclaimed strategy plain, shadow the Romans like wolves, strike baggage, scorch crops before them, drown them in distance and hunger. Yet pride urged a spectacular finish, and the war chief chose the next battleground, an oppidum astride rivers and roads, famed for horse fairs and vast grain barns. Its name was Alesia. Alesia rose from a limestone spur at the meeting of the Osrane and Ouse, its triple ramparts stepping down like giant stairs toward wheat-rippled plains. Within its walls tents multiplied until the streets throbbed with every accent of Gaul. Armoricans from the salt marshes sharpened hatchets beside sequiny archers, Bituriges swore oaths over silver-rimmed cups, Druids painted blue spirals on warriors' brows, invoking Teutates to seal their courage. Grain from nearby barns was hauled inside, stacked in clay-lined pits that kept damp at bay. Vercingetorix reviewed the mass from a wooden tower, his cloak snapping red against the late summer wind. Here, he told his captains, freedom would plant roots or perish. Caesar marched north from the Saone with 10 legions, reforming columns by the hour as scouting reports shifted. Light cavalry from Hispania rode wide arcs, counting campfires, mapping folds of ground. By dusk of the 5th day the Roman vanguard crested Morne Rea and saw Alesia ringed with campfires like a fallen constellation. Caesar halted, gauging slopes and streams, then ordered entrenchments in a vast circle, no assault, only containment. He remembered Gergovia's heights, he would bleed the Gauls with hunger, not men. The circumvallation began at sunrise, 12 Roman miles of ditch, rampart, and palisade. First a pair of trenches, one filled with water diverted from the Osrane, then a wall of earth 10 feet high, faced with sod and crowned by a breastwork of sharpened stakes. Inside, at 40-pace intervals, rose towers of interlocked timber where Scorpio catapults could sweep the ground. Between wall and ditch legionaries planted sipi, young tree trunks trimmed to barbed points and buried so only jagged tops showed. Beyond them lay lilies, pits disguised with brush, each concealing a sharpened stake. Work gangs labored in relays, chalk dust whitened sweat-streaked arms, and hammers rang day and night like relentless drumbeats. Vercingetorix watched from the city rampart as the iron girdle tightened. He sent cavalry sorties at dusk, hoping to scatter work parties, but German mercenary horse on Caesar's flank countercharged, tossing the Gauls back through their own gates. A council met under flickering torches. Some elders urged a breakout at once, others counseled patience, certain relief would come. In the end, riders slipped out under moonless skies, threading gorges the Romans had not yet fenced, to summon every tribe still uncommitted. Drums echoed across the Morvan, and a fresh levy converged, 250,000 by Gallic count, nearer half that by Roman, but fierce enough to tip the scales. Caesar, forewarned, built a second line, the contravallation, facing outward, mirroring the first but larger still. Thus a fortress of men encircled a hill, and another fortress encircled the men, an earth-wrought will whose hub was Alesia and whose spokes were fear and resolve. Supplies for the legions now marched from distant provincia in shielded wagons, every grain sack lost to raiders bit deep. Early in September the relief host arrived, banners bright with new-forged hope. They camped on the plateau of Grasigny, horns saluting those trapped within. Next dawn they charged in 3 great waves. From Alesia's walls the besieged poured out in tandem, battering Caesar's inner line while allies battered the outer. Dust turned midday sun to tarnish, sling stones drummed, Pila arced like shooting stars. The Roman fortifications held, though at points of crisis Caesar himself galloped between walls, cloak reversed so both sides could mark the commander's crimson. German cavalry broke the first relief assault, but the Gauls withdrew in good order, tightening their grip on the morrow. For 2 more days the pattern repeated, probing attacks, cries of triumph, counterstrokes of desperate precision. On the 4th night, under rain thick as ropes, the relief force hurled its full weight at the weakest spur near the camp of General Labienus. They filled ditches with fascines, dragged scaling ladders across bristling sipi, and seized a projecting tower. Labienus sent frantic word, Caesar mustered 12 cohorts, led them round the rear in silence, and burst upon the attacker's flank at first grey light. Roman cavalry swept in behind. The relieving Gauls, encased between rampart and gladius, broke apart like foam before a cliff. From Alesia's wall Vercingetorix saw signal fires along the relief camp wink out, one by one. He understood. The outer host fragmented, retreating into the veiled hills. Within, stores already stretched thin. A council gathered in the forum. Warriors who had roared for victory now stared at empty grain pits. Some urged a final sortie, others spoke of surrender to save the people. Vercingetorix listened, the weight of thousands upon his shoulders. he ordered the gates barred against further debate and walked alone to the stables, where his stallion pawed restless earth. Dawn would demand a choice that legend would never let sleep. Morning washed pale gold over Elysia. From the inner gate rode Vercingetorix in full harness, cloak fastened by a disk of coral and gold. He passed ranks of warriors who lowered eyes rather than hope. The clatter of their spears against shields marked his way like a failing heartbeat. Across the no-man's strip he advanced alone until he reached the slight rise where Caesar's tribunal stood behind a hedge of standards. The Roman officers fell silent as the Gallic king dismounted, unbuckled his sword, and set it upon the earth. He unlaced the great bronze helm that had flashed atop every charge, placed it beside the blade, then knelt without a word. Wind hissed through withered stalks. For a breath the two men regarded one another, conqueror and captive, futures shifting around them like unseen gears. Then Caesar gestured, and guards led Vercingetorix away. Inside the city gates discipline collapsed. Some clans hurled arms into the ditches and sobbed at the sight of Roman quartermasters measuring rations. Others, too proud for surrender, slipped down night gullies to lose themselves in the Morvan forests. The bulk, weary beyond thought, accepted terms. Horses surrendered, a fixed tribute in cattle and hostages, grain issued for the march to winter billets where they would be counted, assessed, taxed. 12,000 chosen as prisoners of war were divided among the legions, spoils to be sold when next the markets of Narbo opened. Caesar sent couriers galloping to Rome. The Senate decreed 20 days of public thanksgiving, incense drifting above the forum in celebration of a victory they could scarcely fathom. Yet north of the Garonne and in the oak-shadowed folds of the Cevennes no trumpet of surrender was heard. Commius of the Atrebates fled toward the Channel marshes, swearing never to see another Roman face. Lucterius the Cadurcan rallied hillmen along the Dordogne, raiding convoys that hauled timber for new watchtowers. 2 summers of relentless pursuit followed, canton by canton, harvest by harvest, the legions ground resistance down. At Uxellodunum, perched on a cliff whose spring gushed from solid rock, the last garrison mocked the besiegers below. Caesar answered with an engineer's chill genius. Tunnels drove into the hill, timber galleries shielded sappers from darts, and at length the spring was choked, its water spilling uselessly beneath the walls. Thirst rather than steel forced capitulation. To stamp example, Caesar ordered every surviving defender's sword hand lopped at the wrist, enough cruelty to haunt rumor, yet leave mouths to speak of Roman might. By autumn of 51, Gaul lay netted in roads, forts, and contracts of grain. Dismantled oppida sprouted new masonry under Italian architects, villas rose where long fields had lain fallow, mosaics of dolphins floating above hearths once blackened by peat smoke. Auxiliary levies, drawn from tribes lately defiant, learned to march to the rhythm of the tuba, their pay returned as taxes disguised under civic levies, a circle as inexorable as the seasons they once worshipped. Latin words seeped into market chatter, denarius, census, forum, quiet conquerors that armor could not repel. Vercingetorix, iron will now bound by chain, traversed these changing lands on the long road to captivity. He boarded a galley at Narbo, passed the scented shores of Etruria, and entered Tullianum's gloom beneath Rome's Capitoline. 6 winters later the gate opened again. Trumpets announced Caesar's quadruple triumph, amid paraded elephants and painted banners of the Nile walked the man who had nearly united Gaul. His hair, once sun-bronzed, hung dull across shoulders thin from stone-fed sleep. At the end of the procession, beneath the arched shadow, the executioner fulfilled ceremony. No record notes his final words, perhaps silence served him better than any plea. In the provinces his legend outlived the body. Bards melded memory with myth, singing of a prince who fought storm and eagle until earth itself betrayed him. Mothers named firstborn sons after him when harvests looked weak, invoking strength. Yet fields continued to answer new masters, tax ledgers thickened, amphitheaters rose beside ancient groves where mistletoe still clung but chants grew faint beneath the roar of imported beasts. The Celtic world did not vanish, it bent, absorbed, reflowered in hybrid hues, but the age of clan steering destiny alone had ended. Over the rivers where wicker wheels of Lunasad once blazed, stone bridges now carried the measured tread of Rome, and the drumbeat that had guided the Celtic heart gave way to the unyielding cadence of the march. In Gaul the seasons rolled on beneath a new order, but across the channel the chalk cliffs of Britannia still shone unbowed, their grassy crests whispering of freedoms now lost on the continent. Tribes there, Catuvellauni, Trinovantes, Debunni, Iceni, watched Roman merchants unload glass beads and Samian pottery at Dewberry, watched tax collectors count cattle numbers with a stylus poised like a threat, yet no legion banners fluttered inland. After Caesar's brief descents 2 generations earlier, Rome had contented itself with influence, letting native kings don client titles while druids continued to guide law and ritual deep within oak groves lit by midsummer moons. Those years became a crucible of exchange. From Verulamium's market square spread silver denarii stamped with the stylized horse of Cunobellinus, Hunniking of the Catuvellauni, whose seat at Camulodunum thrived on trade as rich as any Gallic oppidum had once known. Smiths imitated continental fashions, bracelets of twisted electrum, mirrors whose bronze backs bore swirling Latin scrolls now mingled with laurel wreaths. Vine cuttings rooted in Kentish soil first yielded wine sour but serviceable, an amphory of oil reached even the marshlands of the Iceni. Rome, without marching, seeped into the island's pores like steady rain. Yet subterranean currents ran counter. The Druid colleges on Ynys Mon, Anglesea's tidal sanctuary of alder and mist, became a beacon for those who feared capitulation. Here law was memorized in triadic verse, here omens were cast from flight of ravens, here future chiefs swore to defend the island's soul. Noble youths from as far south as Dumnonia spent 7 winters among the holy pools, returning with eyes darkened by discipline and hearts distrustful of iron rule. Across the North Sea a new emperor sought triumph to cement a hesitant reign. Claudius, mocked in Rome for halting speech and scholars' stoop, saw in Britannia a canvas on which to paint martial vigor. So in the summer of 43 CE for legions and supporting cohorts, almost 40,000 men embarked from Gessariacum beneath sails white as gull wings. Storms scattered transports, but discipline regathered them on the pebble strands of Richborough. Hooves churned shingle, peeler glittered in morning haze, and the long-awaited conquest began. Resistance flared first in the forests of the Medway where the Catuvallonian war chief Togodumnus ambushed the 2 Augusta amid alder swamps. For 2 days javelins flashed through reed curtains, then legionary engineers felled trees into makeshift bridges, and Roman discipline pressed forward shield edge by shield edge. Togodumnus fell, his brother Caratacus rallying the remnants north toward the Thames. There, among mudflats cut by hidden channels, Celtic chariots wheeled with shrill cries, their side axles clattering, yet legionaries locked shields into testudo, advanced knee-deep through tidal ooze, and forced the passage. Camulodunum surrendered soon after, its wooden palisade no match for the onager stones that toppled gate towers like brittle reeds. Claudius crossed the sea only to receive submission, parading an African war elephant along the streets to assemble chiefs. A colonia for veterans rose upon the conquered capital, grid of streets overlaying the curving lanes of old. Temples to Roma and the deified emperor sprouted where once the sacred fire of tribal ancestors had smoldered undisturbed. Client kings, Cogidubnus in the south, Prasutagus among the Iceni, accepted diadems tied by Roman ribbon, their independence outward but ever narrowing. Farther west, however, the red hills of Silurian country and the high ramparts of the Ordovices lay beyond reach, shielded by tangled woods and sudden rain. To tame these hills Rome dispatched the young legate Publius Astorius Scapula. He built forts linked by arrow-straight roads that scarred valley after valley. Caratacus, undaunted, adopted the tactics of Vercingetorix, harry lines of supply, vanish into bog and escarpment, burn crops rather than let them feed the foe. For 7 winters the chase dragged over rills bright with heather bloom and mountains echoing with hound calls. Campfire tales among legion recruits began to speak the Briton's name with grudging respect, just as an older generation had whispered of the Arvernian king. While this guerrilla war ground on, the social soil of lowland Britain shifted under Roman weight. Villas with mosaic atria studded the Thames Valley, bathhouses steamed where once cattle sheds had stood, Latin curses scratched on lead tablets were tossed into holy springs beside votive swords old as memory. Yet at domestic hearths women still traced spirals on newborn cheeks, and midwinter feasts still raised antlered effigies of Cernunnos, lord of the wild. Two cultures entwined, roots tangled, leaves distinct, and beneath their tension a question brewed: could the balance hold when Rome's appetite, ever expanding, pressed upon tribute and pride alike? That strain would snap first in the flax-rich fens of the Iceni, but for now the island rested uneasy, half Roman, half Celtic, as if the tide of empire had reached its furthest foam line and hesitated. In the hush before its next surge the fires of rebellion gathered breath, fanned by memories carried across generations of how freedom once rose bright against the southern eagle, and how, for a heartbeat at Alesia, it had almost prevailed. Early spring mists curled through the valleys of Cymru as Caratacus rallied one last confederacy among the Ordovices and Silures. He chose a ridge above the swifter Fon 7, where scree slopes funneled attackers into narrow gullies and tumbling stones could serve as weapons. Stockades of interlaced oak crowned the crest. Behind them, women carried baskets of slingstones and boys fetched water from hidden rills. Fires kept low to hide strength, yet every heart beat loud with resolve. Here, they vowed, the grey west would swallow the red Roman tide. The governor Astorius marched nonetheless, legion standards rippling against sleet. Engineers bridged marshy ground with fascine mats, artillery was winched uphill, frame by groaning frame. At dawn a horn blast lifted ravens. Ballista bolts clattered into ramparts while auxiliaries from Batavia scaled the left flank, shields angled like turtle shells against the hail of flints. As the earthwork splintered, legionaries forced a breach, short swords worked in brutal rhythm. When the ridge fell silent, only banners stirred, the wolf of Rome and, half-trampled, the white horse of the Iceni that Caratacus had borne as pledge of island unity. Caratacus slipped away, crossing heather-clad moors to the territory of the Brigantes. Their queen, Cartimandua, long balanced independence on a Roman edge. She chose reward over refuge and delivered the fugitive in silver chains. Shipped to Rome, he stood before Emperor Claudius and the Senate, bronzed arms bound yet spirit unbowed. His speech, "Had my success balanced my nobility, I would have entered this city as victor, not captive," won such admiration that Claudius spared him, allotting a villa on the Anio where Italian vines could never dull the memory of Welsh rain. With the western mountains pacified, Rome pressed north. The Legion XX Valeria Victrix carved timber forts up the Dee, while auxiliary cohorts garrisoned marching camps every day's stride. Yet conquest bred debt. Procurators squeezed tribute, new taxes on grain, levies on salt pans, and heavy loans offered at Roman interest. Among the Iceni, King Prasutagus sought compromise, naming the emperor joint heir with his daughters to safeguard autonomy. When he died in 60 CE, Rome interpreted the will as surrender. Loan officers and centurions arrived to inventory assets. They seized horses, melted torcs for bullion, flogged nobles who protested. In the royal hall of Venta Icenorum, the widowed Queen Boudica, tall, tawny-haired, her eyes a storm-dark green, was stripped and scourged, her daughters violated before assembled clans. Outrage crackled through fen and forest like wildfire in summer gorse. Boudica called a moot beside the sacred spring of Andraste. Warriors painted themselves with woad, swore oaths over a cauldron of black ale. Trinovantes from the Thames estuary joined, still nursing grudges against the veteran Colonia at Camulodunum. At the equinox they marched, chariots bounding over rabbit-browsed turf, bronze scythes glinting on axles. Camulodunum's temple to Claudius, mockingly nicknamed the tax collector's castle, fell first. Timber roofs roared into flame, statues of victory toppled face first into embers. The Legio IX Hispana, hurrying south from Lincolnshire, blundered into ambush. Its infantry were cut down almost to the eagle, survivors fleeing behind their cavalry screen. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, fresh from ravaging the Druid sanctuary on Ynys Mon, force-marched east. He found Londinium, thriving trade town of merchants and brothels, undefendable with his scant forces. He ordered evacuation, many lingered and perished. Firestorms turned the timber wharves into molten knotwork, ash swirling so thick it blotted noon's sun. Verulamium met the same fate. In 3 furious strikes, Boudica's host slew perhaps 70,000 settlers and Romanized Britons, their fury fed by decades of insult. Yet the rebellion's very size slowed it. Wagon trains heavy with plunder crawled along Watling Street, and discipline frayed around overflowing ale skins. Suetonius gathered barely 10,000 legionaries, 14 gemina, remnants of XX, and auxiliaries, and took position along a constricted defile backed by forest, its flanks shielded by scrub and steep banks. Boudica deployed across the plain, chariots skirmishing, families arrayed in wagons behind as cheering grandstand. She rode her sidecar before the ranks, hair streaming like a raven banner, proclaiming that the gods of the island would judge between freedom and slavery this day. Roman javelins opened the battle, volleys ripped through dense ranks not expecting distance game. Then the legion line advanced in wedge, iron discipline against mass courage. Unable to envelop, Britons funneled inward, their own wagons blocked retreat. Cavalry swept the wings, slaughtering indiscriminately until the field was a churn of blood, axle shards, and broken standards. Boudicca escaped but soon took poison rather than feel chains bite royal wrists. The rebellion collapsed into marsh and coppice, mopping up actions lasted the winter, but organized resistance south of the Trent lay dead. Rome responded with wary clemency. A new procurator eased taxes, destroyed towns were rebuilt on orderly grids. Yet the memory of chariots circling flaming temples lingered like a bruise on imperial pride. Forts multiplied, roads straightened, but garrisons now trod with caution, knowing an island's heart could flash fire beneath seeming calm. In the north, unsubbed Caledonian peaks loomed, their granite shoulders draped in storm clouds, a mute reminder that conquest remained unfinished, and beyond each horizon waited another ridge of spirit yet to bend. The embers of Boudicca's pyres still smouldered when Governor Julius Frontinus advanced into the hill country of the Silures, threading a chain of timber forts along the Uscan Wye. He posted watchtowers on bare ridges where ravens wheeled, and he set veteran detachments to mine gold in the red quartz seams of Dolocothi. Or wagons rumbled down new metalled roads, their wheels banded with iron that rang like cymbals on frost-hard mornings. Yet even as Roman law planted milestones, Celtic life endured in the folds between, lambing chants in hillside folds, summer fires on tors, and the whispered triads of druid poets now wandering as outlaws from sacred grove to kitchen hearth. In the north, Gnaeus Julius Agricola took command in 77 CE, a strategist as patient as he was relentless. He taught his auxiliaries to build marching camps in a single evening, square as tablet margins, and he wooed local elites with the honeyed promise of Roman schooling for their sons. Timber basilicas rose beside brocks, trade fairs bustled where once only clan councils had met. Yet Agricola's gaze fixed on the purple-blue peaks beyond the Forth, the land the legionaries called Caledonia, realm of painted warriors and uncanny mists. 3 swift seasons pushed Rome farther than ever. The Firth was bridged by a fleet, forts of turf and clay sprouted to the foot of the Grampians. In late summer 83, at Mons Graupius, Agricola arrayed 20,000 men beneath banners stiff with sleet. On the opposite ridge stretched the loose confederacy of Caledonian tribes, their leader Calgacus, the sword-bearer, addressing them in ringing tones barely snatched by Roman note-takers. They make a desert and call it peace. War horns clashed. The Roman line, iron-hinged and sure, advanced uphill behind the deadly glide of Scuta. Auxiliary archers loosed flights that darkened the wan sun. Chariots plunged but found no gap. Cavalry from Gaul and Batavia swept the flanks. When dusk bled over the heather, the Caledonians melted into pine shadow, their dead and dying strewn among shattered target shields daubed with crescent moons. Agricola built no lasting monument. Winter seas battered supply ships, and politics at Rome soon recalled him. His forts hung like solitary teeth across the highland line, untenable without fresh legions. By 90 CE the frontier withdrew to the Tyne's Solway Isthmus, a gap the Romans sealed, first in timber, then in stone, under Emperor Hadrian. The wall that bears his name, 80 Roman miles of squared limestone and turf rampart, rose course by patient course, punctuated by mile castles where hearth smoke curled through slotted roofs. Not merely a barrier, it was a customs gate, a symbol, and a marketplace where Latin, Brythonic, and Pictish tongues bargained over hides and honey. Civilians clustered just south of each fort, brewing beer thick as porridge and mending legion sandals for a clipped coin or two. 2 decades later, restless ambition shoved the line north once more. Antoninus Pius ordered a turf rampart laid between Forth and Clyde, 50 lattice miles capped by timber walkways. The wall stood scarcely a generation, winter rains slumped its sod banks, and Pictish raids nibbled at its watchposts. By 164 CE garrisons retreated again to Hadrian's wall, patching stone and morale alike. A rhythm emerged, push into glens in bright summers, pull back when snows cut the mountain passes, advance of power, recoil of cost. Even as Rome's reach flexed, its presence seeped deeper into lowland soil. Villas marsaked with red-haired Orpheus music appeared along the Kennet, native deities twinned with Roman forms, Sulis Minerva at Aquae Sulis, Nodens Mars at Lydni, sharing altars of votive lead. Market women of the Debunny reckoned weight in library, yet still blessed bread with the sign of the triskele. Enslaved potters from Gaul taught local clay to mimic glossy Samian red, stamping bases with names half Latin, half Celtic, Bellicus, Senevara. Under such hybrid skies, identity grew layered, not erased. A legionary's son might pray to Jupiter at dawn, hear grandmother recite cattle charms at dusk, and carve both onto his burial stone. By the 3rd century, distant tremors shook the frontier. Legions redeployed to Rhine crises, coastal Saxon raiders probed reed-rimmed estuaries. In response, stone-shore forts towered at Brancaster and Portus Aderni, their thick walls bristling with ballistae. Yet galleys could not patrol inland despair, harvests pinched by tax, trade stalled by plagues drifting along empire's veins. Christian missionaries, following merchant routes, lit small fires of faith in hidden vallums near Corinium. Believers etched Cairo on broken altar slabs, merging new gospel with the old rhythm of resurrection in spring. Still, Hadrian's wall held, its sentries pacing cedar-scented ramparts, eyes tilted toward flickering auroras that danced above the moors. On calm nights they heard distant pipes, perhaps wind through standing stones, perhaps the lament of clans beyond the frontier who remembered a time before stone and Latin. For now the wall marked the limit of Roman breath, but beyond its shadow the pulse of the Old North throbbed, patient as rooted oak, awaiting cracks in mortar and in wool alike. The 3rd century sun climbed over Britannia more faintly year by year, as if the empire's great flame across the sea were guttering and its light dimming upon the wall. Garrison still drilled at dawn, horns echoing between turf rampart and grey sky, but pay chests from Gaul arrived late, light, or not at all. Officers quietly bartered surplus grain to keep men loyal, centurions accepted local brides whose families could feed a cohort through lean months. The wall endured, yet its stones fell to slow unclasping, like frost easing the grip of iron on oak. From the north the Picts pressed harder. Their raiding parties slid through misted bogs, scaling crags the watchtowers overlooked, leaving only a scatter of hearth embers to mark their passing. In the west, coracles from Hibernia rode moon-tugged tides, Scotty raiders leapt ashore near Ravenglass, swift as otters among the dunes, snatching livestock and vanishing before cavalry could saddle. Each raid seemed small, but the rhythm of blows wore thin the fabric of imperial rule. Amid this strain a sailor commander named Carausius seized a moment. Charged with clearing Saxon pirates from the Channel, he kept for himself their captured gold, but the silence of frontier legions, and in 286 CE proclaimed Britannia independent, with coinage bearing his bearded likeness flanked by Neptune and the Labarum. London mints clattered night and day, a navy of clinker-built galleys patrolled from Dewberry to the Humber. For 7 winters the island stood apart, half rebel, half protector of Rome's lost ideals, until imperial fleets under Constantius Chlorus reclaimed the coast and ended the glittering interlude in a single decisive campaign. Constantius and his son Constantine lingered long enough to shore the limes, refortifying York's stone circuit and planting fresh altars where legionaries might swear to the unconquered sun. But when Constantine was hailed emperor in Eboracum in 306, he carried his ambitions east, toward the Danube and the Tigris, leaving Britain to whatever strength remained in local civitas councils and now-aging troops. Around this time quiet revolution stirred beneath visible events. Missionaries from Gaul, holding leather-bound books instead of spears, walked the old Roman roads, preaching a faith in which the cross replaced the eagle and resurrection eclipsed martial glory. At Venta Salurum a villa owner installed a mosaic of Cairo entwined with Celtic triskelions. In the Kentish downland shepherds traced small crosses on lambs' foreheads beside the ancient sunswirl. The island mind, ever syncretic, folded the new story into old cycles, speaking of Christ rising with the springtime wheat and Mary cloaked in stars like Regantona, horse goddess of travelers. Yet no creed could seal the frontier. In 367 a concerted storm, remembered as the Great Conspiracy, burst. Picts crashed the wall from the north, Scotti the west coasts, Saxons the eastern shoals, while disaffected garrison troops mutinied behind them. Signal fires leapt ruinously, Corbridge granaries burned, villas along the Nene lay stripped, their tesserae trodden into mud. Imperial response came under Count Theodosius, who landed at Rutupii with crack comitatenses, reopened roads, rebuilt mileforts, and drove raiders back beyond the firths. For a moment order flickered anew, but the cost was clear. Without prompt armies from the continent, Britannia drifted toward the whirlpool of its own necessities. Thus local leaders rose. In Dumnonia, a commander named Geraint ringed hilltops with stone and trained farmers in spearwall drill. In Viraconium, elders rethatched basilica roofs, turning the old forum into a granary cooperative. A mosaic in its apse newly depicted the phoenix, rebirth out of ash, eyes set with green glass recycled from broken wine jars. Latin still guided contracts, yet speech in lanes thickened with Brythonic cadence. Children learned to count both by Roman numerals etched on abacus beads and by the old Celtic tally of sheep knuckles and full moons. By the opening of the 5th century, Rome reeled under Goth and Hun, garrisons were recalled piecemeal. In 402 Stilicho withdrew units from the wall. In 407 Constantine III carried the remaining field army across the Channel in one final bid for continental power. Letters from Honorius in Ravenna told the Britons to fend for themselves. No legions marched back, only rumors did, borne on winds that smelled of smoke from cities burning far beyond the horizon. Yet the island did not fall silent. In the north, Pictish hill forts glimmered with new trade silver. In the west, Irish settlers tilled damp Ceredigion valleys, their Ogham stones sprouting beside weather-worn Latin memorials. Along the Thames, a Saxon foederati village grew around an old supply depot, its timber halls echoing with unfamiliar alliteration, but its blacksmith still forged keys in the Roman pattern, and its healer whispered triadic charms learned from a captured Briton wife. Thus Britannia entered a twilight neither wholly Roman nor wholly lost, villas crumbling but wheat still sown, churches rising while druids muttered in new thickets, fort walls gapped yet watchfires lit on hilltops in subtle relay. The Celtic heart had bent beneath the eagle yet never snapped. Now, freed of its weight, it beat in new rhythms, readying for trials that would arrive on the long-keel ships already nosing through mist at the edge of sight. When spring spread pale green over the abandoned parade grounds of Davor, messengers carried news that Hengist Saxons had driven another wedge along the Medway. Timber halls rose where Roman mansions had soothed weary couriers, and smoke from peat hearths now curled above broken hypocausts. Yet the island was no empty prize. South of the Severn the western kingdoms hardened, dovered in its sea-girt fastness, glide-wising along the tidal flats, and Powys astride the old legion road. Their warlords spoke Latin in council yet swore oaths on rings carved with twining beasts, memory of an art that once danced upon Celtic shields. Foremost among them stood Ambrosius Aurelianus, son of noble refugees from the last legions. From a ruined fort at Caer Gwintgig he gathered cavalry of mixed blood, Roman-trained equites, hillmen on shaggy ponies, and defiant youths whose fathers had fallen to the Germanic axe. Chroniclers later cloaked his early skirmishes in mist, but they agree he tilted the balance, hedging Saxon thrusts behind earthworks hastily thrown across trackless downs, striking where raiders strayed from their longships in search of cattle. Meanwhile on Ireland's western edge a different fire kindled. In tiny beehive huts of Skellig and the oak-scented valleys of Armagh, monks coaxed Latin letters into the music of insular script. Patrick, once a kidnapped shepherd, returned robed in saintly zeal, baptizing chieftains beside holy wells still dedicated to Brigid. He did not shatter the old order, he wove it anew. Druids who surrendered their staffs took up reed pens instead, illuminating psalms with spirals echoing ancient Torc engravings. Thus the gospel arrived riding Celtic art, not extinguishing it. Across the North Channel, Dalriadan warbands from Antrim steered skin-hulled curraghs toward Kintyre's heather slopes. They carried cattle, seed grain, and a royal line claiming descent from Fergus Moore. On coastal headlands they built stone duns, stones rough yet resolute, rallying kindred already settled among the Pictish shore. Gaelic speech mingled with Prytanic tongues, both rooted in the primal branch cut centuries earlier east of the Rhine. Hilltop fires now signaled not Roman orders but kin alliances, each spark a stitch in the tapestry of a new Alba. In Britain the struggle sharpened. Saxon federates along the North Downs broke truce, pushing toward the Thames ford. Ambrosius answered by calling every petty king to a grand council at Caer Badon, the hot spring city the Romans had christened Aquae Sulis. There, amid crumbling baths where steam still ghosted shattered columns, they forged a compact 50 warbands to muster when the beacon on Salisbury Hill was lit. Gildig, they named him overall leader, though his power lay in persuasion, not coronet. Years of raids followed, their details blurred by Bard's exaggeration. But at last, perhaps in the closing decade of the 5th century, the Saxon tide gathered for a decisive push. They chose the old ridgeway, aiming to sever Wessex from the west. Ambrosius met them near Mount Badon, arraying shield walls on a spur overlooking marshy ground. Morning rain slicked chalk turf, Saxon arrows hissed harmless against wicker targes soaked in brine. At his signal the left flank surged downhill, cavalry driving lances capped with boar-tusk points. Saxon ranks, cramped and surprised by the slope's bite, snapped. Chase rolled 12 miles to the Avon mouth. Gilders, writing decades later, would claim 44 years of respite began that day, and though numbers lie, the lull they frame rings true. While border watchfires dulled, learning flowered. On the Isle of Iona, the monk Columba grounded his coracle in 563, vowing never again to see Irish soil. He raised a wooden church where salted wind plaited prayers with gull cries, and from that base disciples trekked into Pictland, trading psalms for safe conduct. Kings accepted baptism beside the same sacred stones where they swore oaths by sword hilt, faith led upon faith like paint on a long-used shield. Scriptoria multiplied. At Lindisfarne and Bangor, at Clonmacnoise and Kells, quills dipped in O'Gorlink traced gospel words that unfurled into interlace, knots without end, roads for the eye to wander as the soul did through time. In their margins crouched lions with tails that morphed into vines, testimony that the old Celtic joy in living line had found new canvas. Illumination carried prestige equal to any talk. Kings sent sons to learn not war alone but letters, thinking mastery of both might anchor realms amid shifting tides. Yet danger was never distant. Frankish merchants whispered of a new surge of long-keel ships along Jutland's bights, crews hardened by icy surf and hungering for warmer plunder. On the continent, Byzantium's distant thunder signaled wars that would redirect trade and tribute. In this pause between storms, the Celtic inheritance, resilient, adaptable, stood poised again at the crossroads of fate, ready to braid with fresh threads or fray beneath harsher winds. The tale, like the intricate knots of its own artistry, had not reached its final turn. The quiet that followed Badon let fields recover and children grow tall, yet beneath the surface the island's fabric kept shifting, thread by thread. In Gwynedd, Maelgwn, grandson of Cunedda the Bear, raised a timber palace at Deganwy where sea spray struck the chalk cliffs like silver dust. He patronized poets whose harp strings echoed beyond Snowdon's peaks, spreading renown through verse rather than spear. In Dumnonia, King Geraint's riders patrolled the old tin roads, while to the north the kingdom of Reged flowered beside Solway sands under Urien and his son Owain, figures later draped in legend yet grounded in cattle raids and river fords held at dawn. But peace bred rivalry. Welsh princes quarrelled over the fertile valley of Penguin, Strathclyde-eyed Galloway's herds, everywhere small borders hardened behind new hill-fort revetments. Into that patchwork stepped the Anglian house of Bernicia. From the basalt bluff of Bamburgh, Ida's heirs probed south along Deer Street testing shield walls grown complacent. At Cattraeth they met a coalition of northern Britons who drank mead for 3 nights before riding east. Dawn found them ringed by spears, their poet's boasts drowned beneath Anglian horns. The lay of their fall, why Gododin, would one day mourn 300 gold-talked men who charged and did not return, but in its hour the defeat opened the veil of the ware to settlers whose speech rasped with unfamiliar consonants. Yet borders were more than earth and sword, they were lines of faith. In 597 a small fleet under Augustine beached beside Thanet's marshes, bearing relics and a letter from Pope Gregory. Ethelbert of Kent, married to a Frankish Christian queen, granted the strangers ground within the ruined walls of Roman Canterbury. From there, Latin liturgy flowed eastward again, its processions bright with silk and incense. Monks from Iona watched wary, their own rule, traced to Columba, reckoned Easter by an older moon count and trimmed clerical hair in the druidic tonsure that ringed the skull like rising sun. The conflict sharpened when Oswald, exiled prince of Bernicia, found refuge on Iona's wind-scoured strands. Baptized beneath standing stones, he returned in 634, won back his throne at Heavenfield, and invited Gaelic monks to Lindisfarne. Their Aidan taught scripture in soft Hibernian cadences, walking barefoot between villages, giving bread to beggars even when royal guards shivered in fur cloaks. Northumbria bloomed as a hingeland, Anglian in speech, yet steeped in Celtic devotion and artistry. Southward, however, the Roman mission gained ground. At Whitby in 664 Oswio of Northumbria summoned both parties to decide one rule for all. Hilda of the Abbey listened while Bishop Colman defended Columba's reckonings and the Roman Wilfrid argued for Peter's keys. Oswiu, fearing fracture with the continent, chose Rome's calculation. Colman and his monks sailed back to Iona. Wilfrid's clergy spread Latin chant through limestone valleys. The decision did not erase Celtic practice, it lingered in western glens and Irish cloisters, but it tethered the rising English kingdoms to Europe's southern spine. Across the Channel another Celtic branch found new soil. Wars and overtaxation in post-Roman Britain pushed families to Armorica's rocky coast where they cleared forests for barley and named settlements after departed saints, Guenole, Brioc, Mallow. Breton speech, cousin to Welsh yet salt-edged by French loanwords, filled markets where fishermen bargained for mackerel beneath wooden crucifixes. The peninsula formed 3 small kingdoms, Domnany, Cornuail, and Browarrick, each ruled by chiefs bearing both torc and pectoral cross, reminders of a people who carried their past within their very breath. On Ireland the high kingship of Tara waxed under Diarmait mac Serbail, whose sword-arm defended poets even while few tore clan from clan. Scholars in Clonard compiled the Censures Mar, a law code weaving Brehorn precedent with Christian mercy, declaring that no plough ox could be seized for debt lest the land itself starve. Along the Shannon longboats still raced in cattle raids, yet pilgrims also set sail for distant Frisia and Alba, hungry to green the desert of hearts with gospel seed. Thus by the close of the 7th century the Celtic world lay in many pieces, some shining, some scarred, none yet broken beyond repair. Its genius for adoption showed everywhere, Latin hymns carried on pentatonic airs, Roman letters knotted into endless spirals, kings ruling from halls where wolf heads grinned beside silver reliquaries. Pressure from Saxon shore and papal decree could bend, but not erase, a culture whose roots reached down to Iron Age hearths and whose branches, though pruned, sent out fresh shoots wherever wind or tide conveyed its wandering seed. When the first faint light of the 8th century touched the western rim of Europe, Celtic monasteries glimmered like beads on a thread of ocean and river roots. At Kells, scriptorium walls echoed with the rasp of quills as monks set peacock blues and saffron yellows into vellum, their pigments mixed with honey and egg to survive damp nights. Each decorated capital unfurled vines that curled into beasts, as if the ancient Latine line had traded bronze for ink yet kept its restless grace. The Lindisfarne community followed suit. Eadfrith's Gospel opened with a carpet page whose cross blossomed from interlaced hounds, geese, and triquetras, a weave binding the island's Celtic past to its Anglian present. Kings prized such works as much as iron. In Gwynedd, Lap Rodri sent envoys across the Irish Sea requesting a single illuminated psalter to seal alliance. In return he gifted 20 puncheon casks of Anglesey salt. Scholarship crossed frontiers, too. Irish Peregrini walked dusty roads to Pavia and Bobbio, carrying wax tablets strapped beside travel staves. Frankish clerics followed them home, eager to copy computers' tables that reckoned Easter with uncanny precision. Charlemagne, hearing of this northern learning, summoned Alcuin of York to Aachen, and thus the insular hand, tight, angular, flowed into imperial chancery, joining Celtic craft to Carolingian reform. Yet the same sea lanes that bore books soon carried long-keel ships striped with shields. In 793, on Lindisfarne's tide-lashed strand, dragon-prowed vessels grounded at dawn. Monks hurried to ring the tower bell but found axes quicker, gospel leaves scattered on blood-dark sand. Word leapt from hearth to hearth, strangers from Norviga sought not cattle or land but silver and souls unarmed. A new front opened, neither Roman nor Saxon, but Norse, and the Celtic shores lay first in path. On Iona, abbots fortified the Brayacan mound with palisades, yet raids came thrice in one decade, culminating when the relics of Columba were borne south to Dunkeld for safety. Along the Shannon estuary, the Vikings carved a long fort at Inis Sibtun, log ramparts enclosing workshops where captive smiths reshaped monastery chalices into armrings of twisted gold. But Gaelic resilience answered swiftly. The Dalcase warlord, little Brian MacSenetig, won his spurs ambushing longships as they threaded tidal narrows, his spearmen wading waist-deep to hack oars. Each victory reclaimed tribute and hostages, yet also absorbed enemy craft. Soon Irish crews set their own clinker hulls on River Fergus mudflats, stamping prows with snarling wolves borrowed from northern myth. Farther north, Pictish fortunes shifted. King Ingus had once marched banners of double raven across every glen, but after his line faltered, the Gaelic kindred of Dalriada pressed east. In 843, Kenneth mac Alpin, Synod mac Ailpin, summoned both Pict and Scot nobles to Scone's Moot Hill. There, in a right old as oak but whispered in two tongues, he set a single stone beneath him and claimed the crowns as one. Alba was born, stitched from Gaelic lore and Pictish memory, its emblem the cinnamon chalice knot of St. Columba ringed by 7-point stars. Though later legend would darken the unification with tales of treachery, the truth was subtler: intermarriage, shared peril, and the slow logic of survival under Norse shadow. On the Armorican Peninsula, Breton riders known as Scubert swept Carolingian marches, their mounts small yet tireless. Nomino, chosen by local Wittens as duke but hailed by bards as king, broke Frankish lines at Ballon in 845, then at Gengland a decade later. His standard, the ermine canton later famed on Brittany's flag, flew beside processional crosses borne by monks from Redon, who chanted in Latin even as slingers unleashed stones. Frankish capitularies lamented the love of liberty in that storm-tossed people, unaware they praised the core that had carried Celts across centuries. Amid conflict, culture still budded. Metalworkers in Cornwall perfected enamel inlays, fusing crimson glass into grooves on pewter brooches shaped like running stags. In Dyfed, court poets codified Singhaind, arranging consonants to chime like harp strings. Their verses praised both spearwork and scholarship, holding warrior and monk in the same polished mirror. Even Viking settlers, wintering on Lough Neagh, traded walrus ivory for these brooches and hired Welsh scribes to tally tribute, evidence that, like wind shaping Dune, Celtic artistry etched itself onto every new presence. By century's end, the Gaelic High King, now styling himself Ord Ri over Ireland and much of Britain, convened an assembly at Tara where Norse jarls bowed in token fealty and church fathers debated canon law in 2 languages. Outside the stone hall, traders bartered furs, salt, and amber, conversing in a pidgin of Norse, Gaelic, and Brythonic words. Such moments, fragile, flickering, revealed a mosaic pattern. Invasions fractured the Celtic world, yet each fracture offered edges that could fuse with something new, sustaining an identity supple enough to bend yet firm enough never to vanish. Thus the centuries-old dance of resilience continued, monks raising towers beside blackened ruins, warriors adopting enemy iron to guard inherited earth, scribes knotting ever more intricate patterns that mirrored the tangled path of their own endurance. The northern lights shimmered above Hebridean seas, and in their colors one might read both warning and promise, sign that the story, far from closing, was entering another bright and restless turn. Across the turn of the 10th century, frost lingered longer on the thatch of Irish ringforts, yet the fires within burned confidently, for the island's mosaic of Tuatha had learned to live with northern neighbours. The long forts at Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Cork, once Spartan raider camps, had grown into warrens of plank quays and gabled halls fragrant with pitch and honey ale. Norse jarls now minted pennies stamped with both cross and hammer, and their sons, fostered in Gaelic courts, recited verses of the Fianna as fluently as sagas of Odin. Trade threaded every inlet, hides from Meath, wine from Armorica, walrus ivory bargained upriver with Connaught chiefs whose coracles once fled such prows. Yet beneath commerce simmered ambition. In Munster the Dalcase clan, born in bog and quarry, gathered strength under a leader named Brian MacSenetig. Orphaned amid internecine strife, he learned early the worth of swift retaliation and generous recompense. He raided the Shannon longships not to destroy but to claim, captured crews found service in his own fleet, and their clinker craft became the ribs of a river navy unmatched in Ireland. By 978 Brian's banners, blue silk sewn with a blazing hand, floated over Kincora, his hillfort above the wide bends of the Shannon. From there he launched campaign after campaign, toppling rival kings of Leinster and even humbling the proud Norse of Dublin at Glenmamar, where frost-silvered gorse ran red before midday thaw. North of the Firth of Forth, Alba consolidated beneath Constantine too. He convened councils at Scone where Gaelic lawmen and Pictish mormaers sat upon the stone of destiny in turn, sealing unity with interwoven oaths. To the south, the English kingdom of Wessex, tempered by Alfred's Burr fortifications, pressed northward, its coinage and clergy following spearheads. When Aethelstan in 927 subdued Northumbria, he summoned Constantine and Welsh princes to Emont Bridge, compelling pledges of peace. For a season borders held, stitched by hostage exchange and shared dread of renewed Norse assault from Irish seas. That assault came in 937 when Olaf Guthfrithson, heir of Dublin's throne, allied with Constantine and Strathclyde's Owain to break English ascent. Their fleets landed at the Humber, shield walls formed on the plains of Brunanburh, where autumn mist clung to rye stubble. The clash was ferocious, 5 kings and 7 jarls fell, so the scop sang, and ravens feasted until they could not rise. Aethelstan's victory barred Celtic and Norse hopes of reclaiming the old Anglian north, yet it also tempered Wessex ambitions. The English king withdrew, content to guard rather than overrun. In the west, Huel-Dada of Deheubarth travelled to Rome, the first Welsh ruler to kiss the fisherman's ring. Returning, he summoned jurists and bards to tie Gwyn ar Daff, compiling Cyfraith Huel, a law resonant with Brehorn sensibility, land divided equally among sons, compensation graded by the honour price of every free man, protection for wife, poet, and plough ox alike. Written in Latin but sung in Welsh memory, the code braided Roman rigour with Celtic equity, fortifying identity more surely than timber palisades. Across the sea, Brittany weathered its darkest gale. Northmen led by Hasty poured from the Loire, sacking Nantes and driving Duke Alan the Great into dusty exile. For 2 decades the duchy lay hollow, villages paying tribute in salt fish and children. Yet since cults persisted, pilgrims still trekked to St. Anne d'Auray, and monks smuggled relics inland when smoke rose on the horizon. In 939 Alan's grandson Alan Barbatot returned with Frankish aid, routing the Vikings at Trans-la-Forêt amid chest-high ferns. He rebuilt walls at Rennes in polygonal towers that blended Carolingian stone with the curved bastions of ancient hill forts, proof that defeat could refine rather than erase. By mid-century, Viking power itself was changing shape. In Dublin, King Sigtrygg's silk beard embraced baptism, endowing Christ Church with silver candlesticks hammered by Hiberno-Norse smiths whose knotwork echoed both interlace and runic twist. Traders from Iceland offloaded falcons and coarse wool beside Connaught slingers hawking bog-milled linen. Intermarriage birthed surnames like Mac Torcale and O'Hemer, neither wholly Gaelic nor Norse but proud of both currents. These tides of war, law, faith, and commerce mingled as rivers at an estuary, their brackish swirl forging a renewed Celtic self, outward-looking yet tenacious, fluent in the language of encroaching powers yet still singing ancestral cadences by hearthglow. Clouds were gathering, the Normans on the Seine, the reforming popes of Rome, but in this breathing space the Celtic realms, diverse yet kindred, stood with heads unbowed, hearts attuned to both the old drum of oak forests and the clang of new-forged bells calling the faithful to matins beneath a sky that had never ceased to widen. The century's dawn found Celtic realms walking a ridge between triumph and uncertainty. On Easter morning 1014, banners snapped above the tidal flats north of Dublin, where the river Tolka met the sea in brackish pools. Brian Boru, now odd R.I., grey-bearded yet unbent, arrayed Munster pikemen beside Connaught slingers and Dublin Norse who had come over to his gold. Against them stood Sigtryg Silkbeard's rebel fleet reinforced by Isleman Vikings and Leinster Kerns, all commanded by the fierce Jarl Broyer, mail shirt glimmering like wet slate. At sunrise, church bells from Christ Church drifted across the marsh, answered by pagan war horns, two faiths summoning courage in rival tongues. Clontarf unfolded with the grim symmetry of saga. Shield walls ground forward, blades sparking in seabird shrieks, ebb tide sucked corpses from the strand, then flung them back, armor sand scoured. As twilight bled across cloud, Broyer hacked his way through the king's bodyguard, but Wulf the Quarrelsome, Brian's towering kinsman, drove him into the surf and, legend claims, tore him asunder. Brian himself, praying in his tent for victory, was slain by fleeing Norse. Yet the field was won, Leinster broken, Norse power bent to Irish rule. Poets hailed Brian as last high king beneath one canopy of sky, even as his death reopened every rivalry his sword had stilled. Power thus fractured. In Connaught, the O'Conco fortified river islands; in Ulster, the O'Neills refurbished Graianan of Ailicha's ring walls. The Norse towns, shorn of imperial dreams, pivoted to commerce. Dublin coined pennies stamped with crucifix and raven, Cork exported salted hides, and Waterford's shipwrights perfected broad-bottomed cogs built for cargo rather than raid. Gaelic chiefs collected tolls instead of tribute, learning that ports could yield silver without blood if left breathing. Across the Irish Sea a different tempest gathered. Normandy, duchy forged from Viking steel and Frankish silk, had embraced feudal calculus with fanatic vigor. William, bastard son of Duke Robert and a tanner's daughter, fused knightly ambition to meticulous record-keeping, every hide of land tallied, every oath witnessed. In 1066 his sails whitened the Channel, and at Hastings the last English army routed in Wessex fell beneath cavalry pin-charge and arrow storm. The shock waves of Norman triumph rolled outward, rattling Welsh marches and Scottish lowlands before their dust settled on Irish shores. Wales felt the spur first. William's captains, Fitzosborne, de Montgomery, de Brios, raised Mott and Bailey fortresses of freshly felled oak atop the red sandstone ridges of Gwent and Dyfed. From these they pushed raiding chevauchés, burning maize-rigged fields and demanding homage. Yet every valley hid ambush. At Llwchwr in 1088, Rhys ap Tudor sprang from bracken with spears tipped in flint and iron, Norman ranks buckled, their pennons drooping in rain. Castles were rebuilt in stone, Chepstow's mighty keep looming over the Wye, while bards sang of green-cloaked archer men whose arrows found visor gaps no ransom could close. A frontier culture emerged, marcher lords owing fealty to two crowns, Welsh princes learning siegecraft from foes even as they kindled old freedom in guerrilla flame. North of the Tweed, Malcolm III Canmore weighed opportunity. Invited to York to swear fealty, he instead harried as far as Durham, carting southbound spoils back over smoking ground. But William's iron resolve matters at Abernethy in 1072, Malcolm submitted, accepting border rivers as lines not to be crossed without consequence. In return he received English lands and a Norman wife, Margaret, pious sister of the deposed Saxon prince. Her arrival at Dunfermline carried more than reliquaries. She reformed the Scottish Church, softened Gaelic rites, and laced court speech with Saxon French, weaving yet another thread into the Celtic tapestry. Farther west stood Brittany, its dukes nominally vassal to Normandy yet determined to steer their own keel. Alan Ferfergent joined William in Jerusalem's First Crusade, his banner of ermine waving beside Norman leopards. Upon return he granted privileges to monastic towns, Quimperle brewed ale free of ducal tax, St. Malo minted coin bearing both cross and curling triskel. Breton knights, expert at couch-lance charges across boggy ground, rode as mercenaries in Anjou's wars, carrying home tales of pointed stone keeps and heraldic blazonry. Still, within parish walls the old tongue thrived, and pardons, saints' festivals, wound through lanes in processions of bagpipes and candle-crowned girls offering cider to passers-by, a reminder that Latin charters could not quench hearth-born custom. Ireland watched all. In 1101, William's youngest son, now King Henry I, granted the seaport of Pembroke to Arnulf de Montgomery, who married Muirchertach Brian's daughter to open a diplomatic door across St. George's Channel. Envoys spoke of papal blessings for an English reform of the wild Irish Church, hinting at swords behind psalters. Gaelic kings heard, weighed, and sharpened blades. Turla Mór O'Connor raised stone cashels along the Shannon's upper reaches, while the Mac Lochlin of the north bought Norse mail by the boatload, preparing for storms yet unseen. Thus the 11th century drew to a close upon horizons dense with fortresses and pilgrim roads, marriage alliances and secret grievances. The Celtic world, still singing to stone circles under moonlit cloud, now navigated courts where parchment seals mattered as much as spear allegiance. It would soon face new crusaders of both church and crown, men who framed conquest as salvation and tallied lands in ledgers rather than lays. But the same resilience that had withstood Rome and Viking prow lay coiled within these peoples still, ready once more to bend, blend, and, when fortune cracked, strike. Southwest winds carried rumours long before sails appeared off Ireland's southern capes. In Leinster, King Diarmid mac Murchada watched his foes tighten around him, Taihanan o Ruach from Brafen in the north, Ruaidri Ua Concobar, High King at Tara, in the west. Cast out after a raid on Meath, Diarmid crossed the narrow sea in 1166, a grey-cloaked exile begging aid from the English court of Henry II. The Angevin monarch, busy taming Aquitaine and Normandy, granted only a parchment license for any subject to help the banished king recover his rightful lands. One copy found its way to Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, called Strongbow, whose dwindling fortunes hungered for new dominion. The first Norman foothold came not with knights but with traders. In 1167 a small band under Robert Fitzstephen landed at Bannow Bay, 50 mailed sergeants and a handful of archers. They joined Diarmid's levies, slingers from the Barrow marshes and Kern armed with boar spears, then marched on Wexford. The Norse-Irish burghers felt arrow fire clatter against plank walls and opened gates after brief parleys. Diarmid granted Fitzstephen lands around Ferns, a bargain sealed with ale and hostages, for the Gael had mastered the politics of gift and gallowglass long before Normans sharpened quill. A year later Strongbow himself arrived at Waterford with 200 knights, their destriers snorting steam in the cold dawn. Siege ladders rose against the old Viking stockade, within hours axes hewed a breach wide enough for banners to billow through. At Christ Church graveyard, Strongbow took Diarmid's daughter Aoife as bride, a union of male and blood that alarmed every chieftain from Braga to Beal Atha Luain. When Diarmait died early in 1171, Strongbow claimed the kingship of Leinster by marriage right, planting a new feudal seed in soil still rooted in Brehon genealogy. Word of these conquests jolted Henry II. Fearing a rival realm of his own barons, the king mustered a fleet of 400 ships, largest yet to leave England, and in October 1171 anchored at Passage East. Storms rattled chainmail as thousands disembarked, clerks with portable desks, masons with chisels, archers stringing yew still redolent of sap. The Gaelic kings weighed options. Many chose submission in form, freedom in fact. In exchange for homage, Henry confirmed their lands and promised good justice. At the Synod of Cashel, the Irish Church accepted Roman discipline, celibate clergy, tithe lists, and stone cathedrals oriented to Jerusalem's sunrise, steps already stirring within its own reforming heart but now hastened under royal shadow. Yet conquest on parchment differed from reality in glen and bog. Beyond the Pale, an arc from Dundalk to Wicklow, Gaelic lords moved as they always had, hosting poets, raiding cattle, forging alliances in fosterage and feast. Norman castles, trim towers of grey limestone with murder holes like grim eyes, rose beside river fords, but their garrisons seldom ventured far. Some, like the de Burghs in Connaught, married into local dynasties, adopting Irish dress and straight-sword tactics. They were soon dubbed more Gael than the Gael. Others, such as the Fitzgeralds of Desmond, carved marcher lordships, mixing French charters with the harp song of Munster knights. Meanwhile in Wales, a last great prince rallied. Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, later called the Great, united Gwynedd and Powys by marriage, treaty, and calculated strike. From his eyrie at Aberfraw he reaved the Marcher castles, yet also penned letters in Latin as polished as any Angevin clerk, courting papal favour. In 1216 he convened a council at Aberdyfi where lesser rulers acknowledged him as overlord, reviving a dream first kindled in the age of Hywel Dda. But Magna Carta and English Baron Wars soon distracted King John, giving Llywelyn breathing room to fortify Snowdonia passes with stone concentric walls inspired by Norman craft yet crowned with dragons of red on white. North of the Tweed, Scotland trod its own precarious path. David I had imported Norman feudalism, boroughs at Edinburgh and Perth, Cistercian abbeys turning heathermoor to sheepfold, but Gaelic thanes still ruled the glens. Under Alexander II, the crown pressed west, negotiating with Norse kings of Man for the Hebrides. Marriage alliances tangled like briar, a MacWilliams revolt in Murray, an alliance with Ulster's Arneil, truces with English earls at Carlisle. Through it all the stone of Scone still anchored coronations, its rough grain a tactile memory of Pict and Scot joined. Across Brittany, the Montfort and Blois claims to ducal succession drew the duchy into wider Capetian Plantagenet rivalries. Yet Breton villages kept the pardons, and Guer's lament still floated over cider presses at dusk. Motifs of Triskele slipped quietly into church carvings, a saint's halo spiraled not in perfect circle but in triple curve, silent testament that the old sign yet breathed beneath high Gothic stone. Thus by mid-13th century the Celtic world had not vanished, it had learned the art of wearing layered skins. Norman writ ran along main roads, but in forest clearings harp strings tuned to modes older than crusades. Stone castles rose, Yet within their halls guests might hear both the chansour of champagne and the haunting syllables of an ashling prophesying freedom beneath a summer swan banner. The dance between inheritance and adaptation, struck on that first bronze torc ages past, continued, step forward, sway aside, never quite yielding the core rhythm of a people who measured worth in honor and the lingering echo of story around a fire long after the embers dimmed. Snow dusted the battlements of Aberystwyth when King Henry III's engineers wheeled mangonels into place, their ash frames creaking like old pines in wind. The siege of 1257 marked a turning. Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, grandson of the Great, struck swift across the Dyfi, torching baggage trains and harrying supply lanes until the English host, half-starved, slunk east. Parliament at Westminster fumed, yet by the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267 Henry ceded to Llywelyn the title Prince of Wales, sealing it with a coronet of hammered silver whose filigree spiraled in ancient knotwork. For 9 short years the dream of a united Cymru glimmered brighter than any torch in a Marcher tower. But dreams attract iron. Edward of Carnarvon, heir to England's throne, found the Welsh prince's homage fitful and his alliances with Scots and Irish unsettling. Upon becoming Edward I in 1272 he summoned muster from every shire, archers from the Weald, masons from Poitou, and bargemen from the Cinque Ports. By 1277 a great host marched along the north coast, shielded by flotillas of ox-drawn supply barges. Llywelyn, pressed into the mountain spine, sued for peace. His lands were pared to Gwynedd ach Conwy. Still he refused to bend entirely, and 5 winters later Edward returned, hauling prefabricated castle frames across Menai Strait. Concentric giants, Conwy, Harlech, Carnarvon, rose in stone rings thicker than any hillfort, their geometry proclaiming mathematics had supplanted myth. Cornered near Silmary, Llywelyn rode to a parley and fell by lance thrust in tangled coppice. The severed head, wreathed in ivy, was set atop London's tower, grisly reminder that even a crown chased with Celtic patterns could not deflect a Plantagenet blade. Yet the valleys did not fall mute. Bards disguised lament as praise, singing of a red dragon sleeping only till trumpets of spring. Carved on chapel corbels, small corgi-like dogs pursued hares in endless circuit, symbols of loyalty waiting its hour. Across the sea Scotland braced for its ordeal. Alexander III's sudden death in 1286, followed by that of his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, left the throne disputed among Robert Bruce, John Balliol, and a web of claimants. Edward I offered arbitration, then demanded fealty. Balliol yielded, Scottish lords chafed under English jurists meddling in borough courts. In 1297 William Wallace, younger son of a Renfrew knight, led pikemen at Stirling Bridge, where English cavalry floundered in tidal mud while Chiltern spears closed like wolf's jaws. For a moment the saltire flew over Berwick unclipped, but after Falkirk's defeat Wallace vanished into heather, a wraith-breathing sedition until betrayal delivered him to London's scaffold. Robert Bruce learned from both failures. In 1306, within the grey nave of Dumfries, he slew rival Comyn before the high altar and seized destiny. Crowned at Scone beneath hurried canopies of hide, he endured a year of exile on Rathlin Isle, listening to waves pound basalt caves. Legend says a spider's persistence taught him, but strategy did, strike lightly, starve garrisons, melt away. By 1314 his companies retook every western castle save Stirling. There, on Midsummer's Eve, Bruce's axemen at Bannockburn hacked English cavalry amid boggy channels while knights of Murray flanked through broomflower thickets. Edward II fled, Scotland's independence breathed anew, though papal bulls and border raids would test it for generations. Ireland, meanwhile, tangled deeper in feudal hedge. The Norman earldoms, once sharp as fresh blades, rusted into quasi-Gaelic lordships. The Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare kept bilingual stewards, the de Burghs of Connaught danced at Beltane fires. Yet English kings feared this degeneracy. Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366 outlawed intermarriage, Irish dress, and Brehorn law for settlers, edicts as porous as limestone cliffs before Atlantic spray. Beyond the pales paling fences, O'Neill horsemen still raised cattle dust on the Boyne. Within, merchants of Drogheda quoted both Chaucer and the Tyne in tavern jest. Brittany walked its own knife edge. The Breton War of Succession, 1341 to 1364, pitted Montfort against Blois, proxy for English and French crowns. Peasant levies under Joanna La Flamme hurled slings at mailed knights, villages swore fealty twice in one harvest, and Gilda Ray, future dark legend, won early laurels at sword's tip. When Montfort's party triumphed with English aid, Brittany preserved autonomy, yet plague ships from Bordeaux soon drifted into St. Malo, and the Black Death scythed half the Dutch's souls. Amid loss, pardons grew larger, processions pleading with saints whose names echoed both Latin and Armorican syllables. Even as power shifted, culture rippled outward. The Book of Taliesin resurfaced in monastic vaults, its 6th-century verses inspiring fresh CYWYDD poets like David Ap Gwilym, whose love lyrics twined forest imagery with courtly form learned from Provence. In Scotland, the Markers adopted Chaucer's stanza yet filled it with lowland Scots so thick one could smell peat in the rhyme. Irish harpers refined the wire-strung clairseach, inventing harmonic damping that astonished Burgundian visitors. Breton sailors charted stars using mnemonic triads akin to old Druidic teaching. Everywhere the Celtic gift for weaving new threads into ancient looms survived sieges, edicts, and plagues. Thus, as the 14th century waned, stone castles dominated skylines once ruled by Hilfert and Broche, yet within their halls echoes of Bronze Age cadence still murmured. Chronicles penned in Latin recorded battles, but between their lines flickered stories sung beside turf fires, tales that promised the wheel would turn again, and the peoples who bent before tempests would rise with the next dawn's restless wind. When the century turned a leaf of ice-glazed vellum, a new spark leapt in the Welsh hills. In 1400 Owain Glynndwr, scholar-soldier of Sycharth, rode beneath a banner showing a golden dragon quartered with the lions of Powys. English stewards had seized his lands, Parliament in Westminster dismissed his plea. Glynndwr answered with fire. Harlech's grey crown fell after moonlit escalade. Constables in Ruthin and Cardiff watched garrisons melt into forests where harp music guided ambush more surely than horn. Bards hailed him Prince of Wales, and at Machynlleth he convened a parliament in flowing scarlet, proposing a university at St. David's and an independent church. For a moment wind on the Dyfy smelled of cedar and parchment instead of smoke. Henry IV marched thrice into the mountains, columns dragged thin by sleet and sap-choked streams. Glynndwr struck supply carts, vanished into peat bogs, re-emerged with French cannon gifted by the Old Alliance. In 1404 he signed the tripartite indenture with the Percys and Mortimers, planned to carve an English realm into Celtic and Northern shards. Yet time and hunger weighed heavier than valour. By 1409 Harlech endured siege until its well-ran brackish, Owain's family were led in chains to the tower. The prince vanished into legend, last sighted as grey-bearded pilgrim crossing the Dee, leaving behind a dream that would hibernate in song for centuries. North of Solway Firth the struggle ripened into dynastic chess. Scotland, bonded to France by treaty and shared grievance, sent bowmen to fight beside Jean d'Arc at Orleans. Many never returned, but their sacrifice cemented alliance. At home the crown staggered. James I grew from hostage boy in the dank keep of Windsor to Renaissance king. Released in 1424 for heavy ransom, he summoned lowland lairds to Perth and recited laws in clipped Scots that brooked no theft of crown rents. Clan chiefs murmured in Gaelic halls, they found ally in Alexander, Lord of the Isles, whose Beerlin fleet shadowed western locks like migrating swans. On Palm Sunday 1431 the clans answered repression with fire at Inverlecky, but James's assassination in a Perth priory reset the board. His heir, James II, took lessons, bribe some clans, break others, and drag a royal mortar from Edinburgh to crumble Black Douglas Keep stone by stubborn stone. Gaelic Ireland meanwhile pivoted on uneasy balance. Richard II had crossed with gilt armour in 1394, exacting hostages from O'Neill and O'Brien, yet his recall left pledges to rot. The Pale shrank to a horse day's ride round Dublin. Beyond, O'Donnell galleys traded fish for Bordeaux wine and MacCarthy chiefs coined silver at Dingle. Yet feuds cut deep, O'Connor against Burke, Butler against Talbot. Into this fractious field strode the 8th Earl of Kildare, Garrett Moore, the uncrowned king. Fluent in Latin charter and Irish proverb alike, he ruled by progress, rode circuit each summer, judged quarrels under oak, took pledges of foster sons as surety. English kings, busy with roses red and white, let him stand, better a Gaelicized Geraldine than chaos. Schools of poetry at Kilkenny flourished under his patronage, keeping syllabic meters alive while printing presses abroad hummed with movable type. Across the Channel Brittany braced for fate. Duke Francis too loved tourneys and troubadours, but stood between anvils, Valois France pressing west, Tudor England fishing for allies. He sheltered rebels, Earl Rivers, Henry Stafford, and signed treaties with Spain, yet defeat at St. Auban-du-Cormier in 1488 forced surrender. His daughter Anne, scarcely 12, inherited a duchy ringed by French guns. By 1491 she wed Charles VIII. Brittany's independence slid into dowry, though estates kept their Breton customary law and pardon still wound through village lanes, black and white ermine flags snapping beneath cathedral spires. Even as crowns shifted, culture threaded old and new. The Aberdeen Breviary of 1510 printed Scottish saints in black letter ink, its margin sprouting knotwork born of Pictish stones. In Wales, William Salisbury began to shape a vernacular New Testament. His glossary rescued root words older than Caerleon's walls. On Iona, monks recopied the Book of the Dean of Lismore, collecting both Gaelic praise poems and ballads of Norse queens, proof that memory could braid foes into story. Harpers in Ulster retuned wire strings to continental temperaments, yet the airs they played, Port Glenabhain, Goldtry, still carried echoes of bronze trumpets found in peat long before Rome cast its first eagle. Gunpowder now spoke where once sling stones rang, and parchment ceded to print, yet the Celtic heart kept remaking the rhythm, absorption without surrender, resistance without fossil. The coming century would test that alchemy under Tudor Reformation and Stuart Union, but in the quiet before the storm one could still stand on a cliff above the western sea, hear gulls cry in triple-note cadence, and believe the oldest song of these lands had not yet spent its final verse. Dawn of the 16th century spilled gold over the Preseli hills, yet shadows lengthened across every Celtic realm. In Wales the Act of Union of 1536 arrived not on war horses but in parchment sealed with Tudor red. Henry VIII, grandson of Owen Tudor, proclaimed shires where camotes had stood and English common law where Brehorn echoes lingered. Welshmen gained seats at Westminster, provided they spoke the conqueror's tongue. Poets answered by polishing cywydd couplets that slipped sly barbs beneath elegance, reminding folk that a dragon still curled in their banners even if its roar must soften into statute. Across the Irish Sea, a harder grip closed. Henry styled himself King of Ireland in 1541, requiring chieftains to surrender and re-receive lands by English patent, surrender and regrant, as smooth in Latin as it was rough in practice. Some lords, like the Earl of Clanricarde, took the parchment and built turreted manors, hedging bets with rose gardens and chapel naves. Others, such as Shane O'Neill of Tyrone, tore the seals and let cattle graze on charters. Shane rode with red-shanked gallowglass, drank aqua vitae from a skullcap, and defied both English deputies and Scottish MacDonnell intruders until betrayal left him among reeds of the River Bann, his head piked over Dublin's gates. Meanwhile Scotland stirred beneath doctrinal thunder. John Knox returned from Geneva in 1559, his sermons at St. Giles a flint shower upon dry heather. Kirk session soon replaced abbots, psalms in vaulting four-part harmony rose where plainsong once drifted like incense smoke. Yet the old faith lingered in glens and on the lips of Mary Stuart, Queen and widow, whose French-tinged court glittered at Holyrood with lute music and cloth of silver. Her arrival ignited faction, Protestant lairds wary of papal shadow, Highland chiefs gauging whether a Stuart crown might shield them from southern ambition. Mary's fall and flight set the stage for her infant son James to inherit more than one kingdom's quarrel. While pulpits clashed, the Western Ocean carried sleek barks flying the red hand of Ulster. Scots from Isles and Lowlands sought land beyond crowded braes, settling Antrim's coast under Sorcha-head Sawley boy MacDonnell. They planted flax, raised black cattle, fused bagpipe with Bodhran rhythms in nighttime ceilidhs. English governors in Dublin eyed this Gaelic Scottish braid with mistrust, yet Tudor energies turned first to Desmond rebellions in Munster. When Geraldine swords rose in 1579, Elizabeth's captains answered with scorched earth, villages charred, mills toppled, fields sown with salt. Refugees thronged ruined cloisters, where friars copied lament into margins of psalters, ink flecked with soot. Not all fires were martial. In Brittany a cultural spring unfurled beneath Duke's College at Nantes. Scholars like Guillaume Postal corresponded with Welsh humanist William Salisbury, trading glosses on Ptolemy for fragments of ancient triads. Printing presses at Rennes rolled out the first Breton language catechisms, their typeface crowded but joyous. Pardons grew ever more elaborate, pilgrims wound 7 times round the Calvary at Plougastel, penitents in white hooded robes carrying ship-shaped candles to beg safe passage for fishermen whose nets ranged as far as the banks of Newfoundland. Wales, too, felt scholarly stir. In 1588 William Morgan completed his Welsh Bible, the cadence of Deuteronomy now flowing through chapel rafters in Ceredigion and over slate roofs of Snowdonia. The language that statutes sought to sideline found new dignity in Scripture, and nonconformist meetings sprouted in sheepfolds, their hymns blending Geneva's stern meters with lilting folk modes. Meanwhile ironworks at Merthyr smelted all that would, in time, forge rails stretching to coal seams still unborn in the valley mists. Back in Ireland the most perilous storm yet gathered. Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, raised by English tutors, yet heir to Hugh I. Neil pride, tired of bowing before deputies who could not pronounce his name. He and Red Hugh O'Donnell kindled revolt in 1594, capturing Blackwater Fort, sending word to Spain for guns and sacrament. Ulster's bogs became vast redoubts, every ford an ambuscade, every hearth a signal station. At Yellow Ford in 1598 English columns collapsed under withering dart and musket shot, for a year the Pale's walls trembled like leaves. Elizabeth poured men and coin into the quagmire, dispatching Lord Mountjoy whose scorched earth marching rings mirrored those of Rome 12 centuries before, burned grain, fell orchards, starved winter into surrender. Relief for the rebels came late, a Spanish fleet anchored at Kinsale in 1601, far from Ulster's heartland. O'Neill and O'Donnell marched south through sleet, only to face Mountjoy's tightened noose. At dawn on the 8th of January 1602, Gaelic pikes charged across frost-crusted furrows and met disciplined shot ranked 3 deep. The rout cracked the rebellion's spine. A year later, with small retinues and aching hearts, O'Neill and a cadre of northern chiefs embarked from Loch Swilly, the flight of the earls, bound for Spain, for Rome, for pages of exile poetry where Ireland would forever wear a harp of sorrow. The vacuum invited a new design. James VI of Scotland, now also James I of England, ordered the plantation of Ulster. Surveyors walked drumlin and bog, pegging lots for Hamiltons and Chichesters. London guilds drew tidy town squares at Coleraine and Londonderry. Yet beneath the gridded farms the old Dincianchers, the law of place, lingered in stones, in Banshee Keen's echoing moonlit shorelines, and in hedge schools where barefoot teachers whispered declensions forbidden in official halls. Thus, as the 17th century unfolded, muskets replaced claymores, charters replaced tribal rolls, and printed sermons vied with bardic memory. But the Celtic rhythm, though muffled, survived, beating in hexameters of an Irish exile's ode, in the triple-time reel of a Highland fiddle, in the patterned stitches of a Breton coif headdress that caught Atlantic wind like a white wing and hinted that a people's flight can also be its far-cast seed. Smoke from musket volleys lingered over the Boyne long after King James's silken standard dipped in retreat. July 1690 branded the Irish soil with yet another reckoning as William of Orange's blue banners unfurled beside Calvinist psalms, promising liberty of conscience to some, conquest in practice to others. Across Ulster, Presbyterian settlers rang church bells in cautious triumph while Catholic tenants braced for reprisals. The Articles of Limerick, lenient on parchment, withered in enforcement. Penal laws soon barred Catholic schooling, voting, horse ownership of value, a lattice of prohibitions meant to starve the old order until Roots forgot water. Yet Roots remembered. Head schools sprouted in dawn mist, a ruined barn, a ditch bank, any nook where a wandering maester could sketch Latin cases in turf and slip Fenian myth between Euclid's proofs. Fiddles carried coded hope in slipjigs, poets cloaked grievance in ashling, dreaming of a maiden who was both island and deliverance. Farther north, linen looms clattered in bleached sunlight. Scots-Irish weavers, heirs of covenant and plantation, beat warp and weft to the rhythm of psalms, their shuttle songs forecasting journeys yet beyond the western ocean. In Scotland, William's victory brought union of crown but unrest of conscience. Highland chiefs, having delayed oath until winter snows blocked travel to Inverlochie, found themselves traitors by decree. Captain Robert Campbell came to Glencoe in February 1692 with red-coated men who accepted MacDonald hospitality for 12 nights, sharing fire and whiskey. At dawn they rose, turned muskets inward, and left 38 kinsfolk sprawled among ash-smudged hearths. Word of the massacre rode every drove road, sealing enmity that statistics could not quell. Still, an older tide pulled hearts toward a farther shore. After the Darien fiasco drained lowland coffers, Scots merchants eyed union with England less a surrender than salvage. In 1707 the Acts of Union passed, merging parliaments, promising open trade with colonial worlds. Edinburgh's Mercat Cross echoed with protest, yet some Gaelic lairds calculated advantage. Cattle now fetched higher price in English cities, sons could seek commissions in imperial regiments, daughters might wed into linen fortunes of Belfast or sugar estates of Jamaica. Beneath calculation, though, the ember of Stuart loyalty glowed. When James Francis Edward, the Old Pretender, landed at Peterhead in 1715, claymores rose from Braemar to Strathspey. Mar's standard whipped crimson against Sleat, but at Sheriffmuir stalemate served Hanoverian cause, and James fled through winter seas. Retribution came as disarming acts, still tacksmen hid pistols in peat. 3 decades later Charles Edward Stuart, bonny Prince Charlie, stepped onto Eriskay wearing tartan, receiving oat cakes and belief brittle as sea-pink flowers on the Macaire. Clans gathered once more, at Prestonpans a shock charge shattered dragoons like glass. But discipline could not thrive on romance alone. On Culloden's Moor in April 1746, Cumberland's cannon tore gullies through charging ranks, grape shot severed bloodlines older than written record. Afterward came the harrying, burning roof trees, banning of bagpipe and bonnet, exile of chiefs to Carolina rice swamps or Bordeaux wine offices. Sheep replaced people on hillsides, the Caithness night echoed with the bleat where once Cayley tunes spiraled into sky. Those displaced found new worlds. Ulster Scots, pressed by rents and Anglican tests, boarded brigs at Londonderry and Larne bound for Philadelphia's muddy quays. They carried Covenanter metal and real melodies, settling Pennsylvania valleys, then the Blue Ridge, mapping names like New Derry and Galax onto Cherokee hunting paths. Catholic exiles from Clare and Kerry followed later, their holy wells exchanged for Manhattan tenements, yet lugging St. Bridget's crosses woven of rush. Across the Celtic Sea, Wales navigated change through chapel and coal. The Methodist revival kindled under Howell Harris at Trafalgar. Miners in the Rhondda sang hymns whose minor keys echoed ancient modes. By 1750 pit shafts gnawed valleys, ironworks at Blaenavon belched sparks that rivaled any Eisteddfod torch, forging rails that would in time carry choirs to competitions where they braided oratorios with Old England verse. Language survived on workbench and pulpit even as London investors counted profit in English coin. Brittany, meanwhile, swayed beneath Bourbon centralization. Salt taxes and trade bans pinched fishermen of St. Paul de Leon. Smugglers in swift luggers skirted reefs, hauling cognac out, English calico in. Pardon still wound their bright processions, yet 1789's revolutionary thunder soon echoed across Armorican oaks. Peasants rallied under the Sacred Heart, white crosses on tricolour fields, in the Chouannerie, a guerrilla braid of prayer and powder. Paris responded with columns of blue coats, but in each wayside chapel candles burned beneath statues where the triskele curled unnoticed at a saint's feet. Thus as one century bled into another, muskets, mills, and ideas of republic and empire churned Celtic lands into crossroads of departure and defiance. Yet whether whispered in a hedgerow Latin class, mourned on a moor where skylarks still rose, or hymned above black slag heaps, the pulse kept time, a reminder that nations survive not solely in laws but in the stories a people refuse to surrender, even as they shoulder packs for continents yet unseen.